Chair recalls Dahlia Blass, Lori Heinel. Please, ladies, if you'll rejoin us at the table. Welcome back. Don't need to, but I'll remind you that you're each under oath.
Yes, sir.
Agreed?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Still under oath. Thanks. We have another document that's a stewardship activity report from second quarter of 2021. And this is a State Street Global Advisors document, Ms. Heinel. I'll let you give you a moment to look at that. Tell us if you recognize that.
Yes, sir, I do. Yes, sir, I do recognize that document. Thank you.
And tell us what it is.
Basically, every year we publish a comprehensive report that is made public that details our voting activities over the course of the prior year.
At the bottom of page 6, there's a heading, European banks continue to be targeted by climate activists. Do you see that?
I do, yes, sir.
Okay, then on the next page, there's a box regarding HSBC. And I'm going to read it and tell me if I read this right. It says, after engaging with our team, along with other shareholders, HSBC committed to phase out financing of coal-fired power and thermal coal mining in the EU and OECD by 2030 and other regions by 2040. And as a result, the proposal was withdrawn by the proponent. HSBC also committed to set, disclose, and implement a strategy with short and medium-term targets to align its financing across all sectors with the goals of the Paris Agreement, starting with the oil and gas and the power and utilities sectors. Did I read that right?
Yes, you did, sir.
So is it correct that SSGA, State Street Global Advisors, engaged with HSBC to limit financing for coal plants in 2021?
That is correct, yes, sir.
Did you ask HSBC to align its lending to the oil and gas industry with the Paris Agreement?
So, yes, we did. But let me give you a bit of context, if I may, please, sir. So what we've seen over the last several years is the emergence of some very extreme shareholder proposals related to asking these companies to constrain their affiliations with energy companies. And that has been a progressive agenda that has increased in intensity over the last couple of years. And there are some parts of the world where these proposals are quite attractive because there are more asset managers and asset owners who are quite aligned with some of that thinking. And Europe is a place that is often called out as a place where there's a lot of intensity around the energy conversation. In this particular case, it was our view that the activist proposal was quite prescriptive and went further than what we thought was appropriate. However, we felt there was a significant chance that that proposal might very well get passed, irrespective of our own personal views on that. So I guess I provide that context, Chairman, because there are times when we try to help the management address issues that we think are in their best interest, but also where the risk of these kinds of proposals might be more constraining than would be otherwise desirable.
Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Please.
Are you saying that if you hadn't done this, there would have been a worse one? Or
well, we don't
understand.
know. I guess what we're saying is that the
confused.
proposal itself would have been perhaps even more limiting than what HSBC ultimately committed to on their own accord. Perhaps.
Well, HSBC just announced it will stop funding new oil and gas fields. I don't know how much further we could go than that. Do you?
So that's a pretty extreme example, and yes, they made that decision on their own accord as a business practice. They made that decision, yes, sir.
So you did not ask HSBC to take that action?
We don't ask them to do anything prescriptive. Again, so I know you're looking at me a little quizzically, so let me try to explain, please. So our general way of engaging with them is to understand what they're doing, understand how that aligns with their business strategy, and understand how they're disclosing and managing those risks attached to that. So we don't ever, I want to make sure for my lawyers here, but it is not, to my knowledge, we do not go in and say to a company, you must stop doing that business. That is not the way that we operate. We go to them and say, if you continue to do this business, these are the risks that we see, and you need to manage those risks in accordance with your business practices.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I want to make sure we're talking about the same firm and the same document. Let's go back to the document that I quoted from. After engaging with our team, along with other shareholders, HSBC committed to phase out financing. They committed to phase out financing of coal-fired power and thermal coal mining in the EU. I'm going to skip, well, I'll just read the whole thing. And OECD by 2030,
yes,
and other regions by 2040. And as a result, the proposal was withdrawn by the proponent. Now, this next sentence. Now, let's be clear.
Yep.
I think we're going to agree that this goes well beyond disclosure. The next sentence says, HSBC also committed to set, disclose, and implement a strategy with short and medium-term targets to align its financing across all sectors with the goals of the Paris Agreement, starting with the oil and gas and the power and utility sectors. Now, come on, that's not just disclosure. That's set goals and implement those goals.
Yes, sir. In that
what am I missing?
No, you're not missing anything. The HSBC did take those actions. I would submit that we did not specifically make that kind of request. We do not prescribe to the companies what they need to do. They took that action as a consequence of a broad engagement that they undertook. Yes, sir.
Could one read this statement? After engaging with our team, they did this. Wouldn't one think that maybe State Street wants people to think that they influenced that decision? You don't want us to think that, but you wanted the readers of this statement to think that, didn't you?
Certainly, we want our shareholders to know that we are engaged with these clients, or these companies, excuse me, and we have a voice at that table. That is true. Yes, sir.
This says, we engaged, and I'm quoting, and as a result, presumably of our engagement, this took place. What am I missing?
The sequencing was we engaged, other investors engaged, ultimately HSBC took action. I can understand the concern about the way that is characterized around our engagement. I do understand that. Yes,
it was a coincidence.
We try to be quite honest and complete in how we describe our engagement. In this particular case, there was our engagement and others, which you can see, and as a consequence of that complete engagement, they took this decision.
Did you have a question, Senator Colhorst? I don't want to, if you don't, that's
well,
okay.
Mr. Chairman, maybe it's just a statement. I mean, when you engage, I think what we're learning here, Mr. Chairman, and I think this is important for all investors to learn, is that the ultimate goal is these large blocks of money. You represent, I could go back through my notes, how many millions of clients you represent. I think TRS and ERS being some of the largest in the world, that this is the ultimate goal, is that we're going to phase out coal-fired plants, which you have one right here in your district, I believe, Mr. Chairman, and oil and gas, ultimately. And so, you know, when you say engage, I mean, engage is I mean, obviously ESG is a scoring system that's ultimately going to move policy in a direction that's something I don't think you could get at the ballot box. You're just using it through investment funds. And I think that every investor needs to understand what's going on, as passive as they may be, as large as they may be, or as small. And I think your points are well made. This is where we're going.
Thank you, Senator. I want to, again, we really want to understand, and these statements appear to us to be clear and unequivocal. They don't look that way to you. So I need to ask you this. Have you provided us all the documents around and involved in this engagement with HSBC?
I believe we have provided all the documents that were requested related to these engagements. If there is something that we have not, please.
Let me ask you this.
Okay,
let me ask this. Let me be fair, because I don't.
Yes,
let me be fair. I'm not sure specifically what we've asked for, so let's just ask
Okay.
right now.
Yeah.
We need everything, all documents, everything you have related to this engagement with HSBC that's described here on page 6. We'd really like to know whether.
Yeah, of course.
So, may we have those documents?
We will get them to you. And again, look, I know this is going to maybe not ring, with you, so I'll just acknowledge that. I do want to push against the idea that our goal is to eliminate fossil fuels. That is not what we believe, and that is not what we have signed up for. What we have signed up for, and what we do believe, is the testimony that you heard earlier from the first gentleman, that there are implications from fossil fuels that are driving climate change, that collectively, as a group on the globe, we've got to try to manage that. And we're relying on how companies themselves are thinking about the implications of that transition and making sure that investors have good information about the company's risks, the company's mitigations of those risks, and the company's disclosure related to those risks. I would also just acknowledge that there are some investors in some parts of the world that have a stronger view on some of these elements. So part of engagement, in our view, has to be to bring a voice to that conversation and help companies think through different opinions and what that might mean for their investor base.
Now, just so I'm clear, are you suggesting that you are a moderating force in these discussions, and it would be even worse than cutting off all funding for oil and gas exploration if you weren't at the table?
So in some cases, I believe we are a moderating force. It's certainly, when we look at some of the activist proposals that get put forward, we find in many cases they are very prescriptive. They are very limiting of a company's strategic options. And we actually get positive feedback from the energy companies that we engage with, that the way we talk to them about these issues is quite constructive for them.
While we're looking at your documents, Annual Climate Stewardship Review 2020, dated October 2020, we're going to pull that up for you. 13643, Council. Got it. Does that look familiar to you?
It does, yes, yes, sir.
At pages 5 and 6, this document discusses proposals in the 2020 proxy season to require banks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with its lending authorities in alignment with the Paris Initiative. State Street voted for proposals for J.P. Morgan, Chase, and Mizuho Financial Group, and it abstained for Barclays. For J.P. Morgan Chase, State Street, quote, supported a shareholder proposal requesting that the company report on if and how it plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with its lending activities in alignment with the Paris Agreement. Did I read that right?
You did, sir. Yes, sir.
And you probably remember this, but just to make sure, are you aware that J.P. Morgan's board recommended against this proposal?
Correct. Yes, sir.
Didn't they say, I'm going to quote them, given the reports and disclosures the firm already makes, the board believes the requested report would not enhance shareholder value. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
But State Street voted for this proposal regardless.
That's right, because
What,
we believed it provided enhanced disclosure for investors to understand their business operations.
Tell us what financial analysis you went through to make that decision. financial analysis?
Well, in that case, it would have been more what were they actually disclosing. So it was less about financial analysis of their business practices and more were they disclosing their activities in a way that would enable investors to understand that business and make an informed choice.
You've made a couple references to Mr. Brigham's testimony, and I agree with you. It was quite compelling. Now, I'm going to ask a question that should be rhetorical, but maybe it's not. Mm-hmm. Aren't votes and pressure like this, and what we just had up on the screen, aren't those exactly why Mr. Brigham experienced what he did with a bank that did not want to loan for an oil and gas project?
So, as I heard his testimony, he was being compelled to say things he didn't believe in order to get a business opportunity. And I would not do that either had I been asked to make a statement I did not believe in.
So votes like this, proxy statements, and then you're claiming that after you engaged, as a result, they set and met these goals. You don't think that discourages banks from providing financing for fossil fuel projects?
I can't say, because these banks have to forge their own business opportunities. What I can say is that we routinely engage with energy companies, financial services companies, all manner of companies, and it's through the lens of, do you understand the risks that you're taking on? Do you manage those risks, and do you disclose those risks? That's the basis of the engagement.
Splash, we have a couple more questions. I want to put you spoke earlier about the letter that you wrote, which you say clarify, most would say contradicts other statements by BlackRock, but your letter to state agencies, we're going to put that up and ask you a couple of questions about that. Give us just a moment to grab that. Obviously, state attorneys general have weighed in on this and will continue to, following Texas' lead in most cases, but we're all working together. This is federalism. And so you spoke about the letter that you wrote in September of 2022 to those Republican attorney generals, again, to clarify some of the statements. And we'll get you a copy of it, but I think you'll remember this. On page 9, you said, BlackRock's engagement and voting around climate risk does not require that companies meet specific emission standards. Does that sound right?
I believe that was in the letter, correct, sir.
And then at page 5, early in the letter, you said we do not dictate to companies what specific emission targets they should meet. Does that sound right?
Correct, sir.
So that's in the letter. Are those true statements about BlackRock?
Yes, sir.
We were looking at one of Mr. Fink's letter to CEOs earlier, and the one from 2022 I'll represent to you. He said BlackRock is, quote, asking companies to set short, medium, and long-term targets for greenhouse gas reductions. He said in February of 2021, specifically, we expect companies to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and accompanying greenhouse gas reduction targets. Companies in carbon-intensive industries should also disclose Scope 3 emissions. And then he said, in a vote bulletin, we ask companies to explain how their business model will be compatible with a global aspiration of net zero global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Do those statements sound familiar?
Yes, sir.
Those statements sound consistent with what you said in your letter?
They are, sir.
They are, okay. Whitehaven Coal, at their annual general meeting in 2021, BlackRock voted against all directors of Whitehaven Coal because they did not, quote, include greenhouse gas reduction targets or alignment with a global aspiration of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So there was some question before about why Florida did what. Here we were told why that vote was taken. BlackRock voted against every director of Whitehaven Coal just last year because the disclosures did not, quote, include greenhouse gas reduction targets or alignment with a global aspiration of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Do you remember that?
Well, I was not there at that time, so I don't remember it, but I do understand it, if that's the question.
So voted against all the directors at the meeting because they did not include greenhouse gas reduction targets or alignment with a global aspiration of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Isn't that expecting them to meet a certain standard and punishing them if they don't?
No, Mr. Chairman, what that's asking for is disclosure. It's disclosure of information that the company chooses its own targets. We don't tell them what those are. We ask for the information so that we are able to assess material risks.
This doesn't say they didn't disclose a target. They didn't disclose a target that was aligned with a global aspiration of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's what it says. Isn't that right?
If I may explain that piece, sir. So
I wish you would.
thank you. I appreciate that. The regulatory framework, not just in the United States but globally, is many countries are adopting regulations around this. And what we are looking for when we're looking to engage in companies, when we're in our engagement with companies, rather, we're looking for companies to explain how they are approaching these regulatory changes, the regulatory risks, potential litigation risks, reputational risks. So that is what we seek to understand. Not that we tell them you have to do X, Y, Z by 2050. We want to understand how they are approaching it from their business perspective and assessing the risks and opportunities. So it's information collection so that we can make the best judgment we can on behalf of our clients in terms of how we can, produce those risk-adjusted returns, which is our focus as a fiduciary.
If they disclose to you a plan that you do not agree with, is that okay? Just so they tell you, here's our plan? Or must the plan align with net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, like you said it had to in that document? Which is it?
So, Mr. Chairman, our goal in our stewardship and engagement and our voting is, frankly, the ultimate goal is long-term performance. This is why we engage. This is why we vote. So if we take voting action against a company, and I'll go back to noting that over 90% of the time we support management our votes, over 90% of the time. If we take voting action, it's because we have concerns with their governance or their performance.
So when you say that you voted against them because they did not include greenhouse gas reduction targets or alignment with a global aspiration of net zero greenhouse gases emissions by 2050, is that a true statement?
In that case, we would be voting against because we did not see from management information for us to be able to assess how they are looking at material risk to their business and giving us information so that we are able to see that as well.
Information on how they'll meet a specific goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Did I read that right? It's a quote from your document.
It's information as to how they are looking at the transition to a low carbon economy, how it impacts their business, and what they're doing about it. We're not giving them a roadmap. This is up to them, but we seek to understand how they are viewing it.
I understand. So your story is that it's not that they were making them set a standard, just tell us what your standard is. So BlackRock also voted against the reelection of the board chair of TransDigm because of a failure, quote, to adopt quantitative greenhouse gas emissions goals. Not to disclose, they failed to adopt quantitative greenhouse gas emissions goals. You voted against the chair. Is that right?
Sir, I don't have the context of this exact one, and so I would like to be very careful. And I will just go to say, is for respect to these votes around reduction targets or, GHG, what we're looking for a company to do is disclose. How are you looking at this? What are your targets? How is your business plan? How are you managing your risks? We do not tell them what the target should be or how they should do it. We want to understand how they're approaching it because we do believe this is a material risk.
You voted against ExxonMobil's directors because, quote, Exxon's failure to have clear long-term greenhouse gas reduction targets, unquote. Not failure to disclose, failure to have. Is have the same thing as disclose?
Mr. Chairman, the vote against Exxon after years of engagement with Exxon was based on performance, 100% performance. The company was underperforming, had lost 60%, that's 60% of its value in the 5 years running up to that vote. Today, Exxon is not only it's outperforming the market and its peers. This was concerns about governance and performance.
So it wasn't about, quote, Exxon's failure to have clear long-term greenhouse gas reduction targets, unquote. That's not true.
It was about performance and governance.
It was not about Exxon's failure to have clear long-term greenhouse gas reduction targets, as BlackRock said it was at the time?
Sir, I don't have the full voting bulletin to parse through it with you.
Well, I'm not parsing. The words are very clear and unequivocal.
But I think the bulletin was quite long and explained the vote in detail. But what I can tell you is, with respect to Exxon, it was seriously underperforming the market and its peers, and today that is no longer the case. This was a concern over the performance and the governance of the company after years of engagement with Exxon.
Senator.
Could you tell me when that vote took place? When was that vote?
The one
When you voted
on
against Exxon?
on Exxon?
You were talking about you'd warned them for years. When was that vote when you voted against ExxonMobil's board of directors?
Ma'am, I don't have the bulletin in front of me. I think it was 21.
Okay, so when y'all voted no, then they just turned it around in less than a year. You're saying that they're outperforming their peers now?
They are outperforming their peers now. I'd also note that Whitehaven, I believe, is not a U.S. company.
I beg your pardon?
The Whitehaven vote, I believe that is not a U.S. company.
Exxon, a U.S. company?
Yes, sir, right here in Texas.
Texas company.
That's right. And we have approximately $27 billion invested in Texas and Exxon on behalf of our clients.
That's our concern. We wish you weren't there.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, my hearing's not great. Did you say 27 billion?
I believe so, ma'am. That's right. We're one of the largest.
Mr. Chairman, your rebuttal to that statement was?
I said that's our concern. We wish BlackRock didn't have such a big stake in Exxon to push them around, bully them, and vote against oil and gas exploration, vote against energy that Americans and Texans need.
Mr. Chairman, I know you noted up there a number of times that BlackRock voted against the sitting board of directors. Did that vote sway? Did they remove members? Are they big enough players in all of those companies you listed that the result of the vote was a termination of current board members?
Yeah, that Exxon vote was pretty big, and again, a lot of folks were following, I would say, these firms in trying to remove directors. Some results were successful, some weren't. Of course, our concern was their voting shares, again, as they've admitted, using Texas money.
Thank you for that clarification.
We're going to get another document for you to look at and make sure we understand it. And while we're looking for the text to put in front of you, you probably remember not long ago, September of 22, the New York City comptroller wrote a letter to Larry Fink on behalf of the New York City pension funds. That's what we read on page, I'll represent to you then on page 2 of the document, paragraph 5. New York City Pension cites several climate commitments BlackRock has made. We're going to get that in just a moment. All right. Does that letter look familiar to you?
Yes, sir.
Okay, page 2 of the letter, paragraph 5. Again, the New York City Pensions, they cite several climate commitments that they say BlackRock has made. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Can you read that paragraph 5? Read out loud, that is.
Is the one that starts with BlackRock?
It's on the climate commitments that BlackRock has made. Do you have it? I can read it if you want. I'll just read it. You tell me if I read it right.
Appreciate that.
And you remember the letter, you know the context. This is the New York City Comptroller writing to Larry Fink, right, about pensions. You're familiar with the letter itself, right?
I am, Mr.
From
Chairman.
here just a few weeks ago. Okay. The letter says, BlackRock has repeatedly and rightly recognized climate change as an investment risk. In your 2020 letter to CEOs, you named climate change as, quote, a defining factor in companies' long-term prospects, unquote, and declared your, quote, investment conviction that sustainability and climate-integrated portfolios can provide better risk-adjusted returns to investors, unquote. Your 2021 letter to CEOs committed to, quote, supporting the goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or sooner, unquote, in line with BlackRock's pledge as a signatory of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, NZAMI, and asked businesses to disclose how they are integrating their own net zero plans into their long-term business strategies. Did I read that right?
Yes, sir.
Can you confirm whether BlackRock has done what the New York City Comptroller said BlackRock has done and made those commitments?
Sir, you have the comptroller's letter to us. I believe that you also have the response that we sent to the comptroller. That
We'll try to find that, but I'm asking if you believe the comptroller's letter to Larry Fink accurately described commitments BlackRock had made. My point is, it sounds like we're not the only one who are reading those documents in plain English. What about the New York City Comptroller's claims?
Sir, in our letter to the Comptroller of New York, we explained how we view our participation in these organizations, which is in line with what I said earlier in my testimony.
So the Comptroller in New York City got it wrong.
Sir, what I can say is we explained in our letter back to him, which is public, how we view our participation in these organizations.
Well, in the same letter, you know, he accuses BlackRock of recently disclaiming, I'm going to quote, disclaiming responsibility for net zero alignment in its own portfolio by saying that it does not ask companies to set specific emissions targets and that its participation in the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative does not mean BlackRock is setting or meeting any net zero targets. And then, here's what he says. New York City Comptroller says, BlackRock has recently touted its continued investment in fossil fuels without specific net zero targets or commitments or any plan for a phased transition away. So it sounds like the New York City Comptroller is frustrated as we are, and that depending on who BlackRock is speaking to, it gives the answer they think is wanted by the person asking the questions. Can you see how one might think that?
Sir, if I may, and I'll amend something. I thought that our response letter was public. It is not, so
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, we will commit to getting it to the committee so that you see our response, our words, and how we approach this.
And just to clarify, and as your lawyer knows this, we have requested not just documents we can get online. Our subpoena and our document request is not limited to public documents, and we'll go to the courthouse if we have to, the other courthouse, to get that done. I want to make sure we're clear about that. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And at BlackRock, as a fiduciary asset manager, What we do is invest clients' money in accordance with their commitments, their mandates, not ours. And I think this is why there's so much conversation, and perhaps I really hear your frustration, sir, but this is our clients asking for sustainable portfolios, our clients asking for portfolios that don't take climate risk into consideration. This is why we truly believe in choice. We're not a balance sheet financing business. We're not the ones that make these decisions. We provide the investment solutions and the products, and our clients are the ones that invest. They're the ones who are choosing what is lining up with their goals. We don't tell them that. That's not our role. We manage their asset to meet their goals.
Again, we haven't seen your response. We're hoping for a response from you here, but on pages 4 to 6 of the document, in bold font, the New York City pensions make 3 demands of BlackRock, and let's look at those. And here's what the New York City Comptroller, on behalf of their pension systems, demands from BlackRock in this letter. He says, number 1, publish an implementation plan that makes clear BlackRock's commitment to achieving net zero across its entire portfolio. And let me pause. A number of times today, each of you has made references to clients who want green investments, who are concerned about net zero. We understand that. But this is one of many quotes we see from net zero asset managers, from Climate Action 100, and from your own documents that say the commitment is across the entire portfolio, not limited to those 6 ESG funds that you were talking about. But back to the letter. New York City says, we want you to publish, back to the letter, we want you to publish an implementation plan that makes clear BlackRock's commitment to achieving net zero across its entire portfolio, with concrete steps that detail how it intends to reach science-based targets on a specific time frame and clear mechanisms to regularly report on scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions for all assets in BlackRock's portfolio. The demands go on. Provide a detailed approach to keeping fossil fuel reserves in the ground and phasing out high-emitting assets. And demand 3, support climate action through transparent corporate engagement that requires disclosure of climate-related lobbying, works to end lending and insurance for new fossil fuel supply projects, and pushes for science-based targets at portfolio companies. Do you remember the New York City Comptroller making those 3 demands of BlackRock?
Yes, sir.
I think you've answered this question. You may have responded to the letter privately, but not publicly. Is that right?
That's my understanding, sir.
Has BlackRock met privately with the comptroller in New York City or with those pension funds to discuss this letter?
I do believe the comptroller is a client, so we have had engagements with the comptroller.
Have any compromises on these demands been made or any deals reached between BlackRock and the New York City pensions based on this letter?
Sir, the comptroller is a client. We handle their mandate, their assets in accordance with their mandates. We handle other client mandates in accordance with the mandates from those clients. We are a manager to a multitude of clients. We believe in choice, and we believe in offering our clients what they are looking for to the best of our ability as an asset manager.
So has BlackRock met these 3 demands put on them by the New York City comptroller?
Sir, for example, if you go up to the very first one, which I can't see now, the commitments, clients make their own commitments with their portfolios. We manage to their commitments. We do not make commitments with respect to other people's money. We look to what they want to do with their assets and manage in accordance with that. Now, as a public issuer, BlackRock as a public issuer has made commitments to reduce our carbon emissions, but that's us as a public company. That's different from our role as an asset manager, where we are bound by our clients' mandates.
So when we see language like this from net zero asset managers, from GFANs, from Climate Action 100, and from your own documents that talk about pledges to address these challenges across all assets, does all assets mean all assets?
Mr. Chairman, I really understand your perspective, and I hear your frustration with the language you're reading. What I can say this, and this is public. You can look at it in our net zero statement. You can look at it in the Climate Action 100 letter that we signed when we joined. We have made it clear that we are fiduciary. We are bound by certain regulations as a fiduciary. We are bound by our clients' mandates as a fiduciary, and that is how we operate.
I'm going to read Goal 7 that you agreed to when you joined Net Zero Asset Managers. And Goal 7 from their website says, pledge requirement 7, implement a stewardship and engagement strategy with a clear escalation and voting policy that is consistent with our ambition for all assets under management to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. Now, all assets under management is not limited to ESG funds, is it?
Mr. Chairman, I know you're reading from their website, but if you look at the letter that we, when we joined, that we put together, this Climate Action 100, we made it.
That was Net Zero Asset Managers,
sorry,
but go ahead.
I
know you've joined so many, it's hard to keep track. I know.
I'm sorry, I apologize. In Climate Action 100, we made it very clear that we are bound by laws and regulations and our clients' mandates. In our net zero statement, we make it very clear that it's our clients' assets that have the commitments. That is a firm limitation on us because it is their money and we are bound as a fiduciary by their mandates.
So where you've pledged to Net Zero Asset Managers, to Climate Action 100, to Glasgow, where you've made these pledges to manage all assets under management along these lines, you didn't mean that. You had your fingers crossed.
Sir, we participate in these organizations as we participate in many organizations around the globe in different parts of our business to be part of the conversation, to understand issues that are important to our clients. But how we act, how we invest, how we vote is accordance with our own principles and our fiduciary obligations.
One more question for now on the New York City Comptroller. You probably remember in his letter, he says if you don't comply with those 3 requests that we read a moment ago, he will pull his $40 billion from BlackRock. Has he pulled his money? Has he pulled the state of New York's money?
Sir, I'm not at liberty to discuss any client that has not said something publicly. If you would, I'm sure you'd appreciate that.
So has BlackRock met those 3 demands?
Sir, as that we will provide you with the letter that we sent to the comptroller. We are a fiduciary asset manager. We look to our clients' mandates. We meet those mandates because it is their money. Our purpose is to provide the best risk-adjusted returns we can for them. And we believe in choice, and choice not just in investments. We're proud of the fact that, sir, like one of the things I think you keep coming back to is essentially our voting. And this is why we truly, truly believe in voting choice. And we have done the absolute best we can to advance voting choice up to the regulatory, hurdle that we have right now. And we're looking to see how we can operationalize that given state laws and other regulatory burdens. We would love to partner with you to make this available for more and more people because we truly believe the more voices, I believe that a lot of your concerns would be addressed that way.
When did BlackRock begin voting choice?
It's taken us years of work to get to the place where we launched it in January of this year. It took about 4 years of work to get it to a launch stage.
So it was publicly launched after Texas and red states began to complain about what you're doing with our taxpayers' money. Isn't that right?
We announced it in 2021, and then it launched, but it was actually something in the works for us for several years. This has taken a tremendous amount of time and resource and technology to get it launched. It's a pretty complex work to do.
Surgical, of course.
Mr. Chairman, you may or may not know this answer. I don't know if either one of you know the answer. You mentioned that there's $40 billion invested in BlackRock from the New York
City pensions, yes, ma'am.
City pensions. Do we know how much, and I wouldn't even go into our city pensions. Let's just stay with the TRS and ERS. Do we know how much is invested with BlackRock or State Street from TRS and ERS?
We have some of the numbers the witnesses may know. Do you know offhand, Ms. Blass, how much money of Texas teacher retirement system, employee retirement system is entrusted to BlackRock? We'll be asking each of you.
I don't have the number right in front of me, and I don't want to say it incorrectly.
You can give us an estimate, just so you tell us it's an estimate.
I don't have the number to give you the exact number, but I will tell you that we are, for our active mandates for the pension plans, we have outperformed the benchmarks for the past 5 years.
And I think, I see the difficult stance, position that you're in, and I want to thank both of you. I think you've done a great job today. Hard to answer these questions. Mr. Chairman, I think from the line of questioning and what we've discussed, Texas is a unique state. Like I said, oil and gas #1, ag probably #2, bounces back and forth with tourism, depends on how you rank industries. Maybe you can't serve two masters. I mean, that's maybe where we are, with New York's demands, Mr. Chairman, and you put up their demands, and then you obviously see Senate Bill 13 and passed by the legislature. And I've, watched some requests by some of our statewides. We've recently had all of our statewides reelected, some to new positions, some not. And I guess, Mr. Chairman, in listening and showing, the balance between where we are, maybe it should be more along the Florida lines where we just say, y'all have made a decision. We respect that decision, and we take our marbles and go somewhere else. Is that maybe potentially where we're headed with this? Because I know the investment practices of, I'll just read, we've done a lot of reading from documents today, but study the investment practices of financial services firms and how those practices affect the state's public pensions, make recommendations to ensure the state's public pension funds are not being invested to further political or social causes. And I'm going to read that last sentence just again. Make recommendations to ensure the state's public pension funds are not being invested to further political or social causes. And I see the Attorney General's from New York's stance, and I respect that. He's duly elected, and our stance is different. And so I think, what I'm concluding here is impossible for y'all to serve two masters. And I get this, all the different, I see all the different funds and you have different boards that govern this and govern that. But as your statements have so eloquently defined today, it's, I hear these inclusive terms, all of our funds, so forth and so on. So I'm not jumping to a conclusion, but I'm certainly arriving at a place that you can't serve two masters.
Please go ahead, Ms.
So, first of all, thank you for being so straightforward about that, because I'll be honest with you, we have that same conversation internally all the time. And I will say, over the years, we've debated whether ESG is a performance enhancement. And as CIO, I've been steadfast in saying, by definition, imposing a constraint on a portfolio, if you just do basic investment principles, that's a constraint. And so I've steadfastly encouraged our teams to not think of ESG as a performance enhancer, for example. They are risk issues, for sure. And again, I detailed earlier some of those. But I think what we're trying to navigate, and maybe what you just said is the sort of dilemma we're all facing, is that, and again, I go back to Mr. Bridgewell's Brigham's testimony because it just hit me so much. If we all do believe that we have to get our arms around climate change, and maybe there are some who don't believe that that's true at all, so that could be true as, there could be people who just don't embrace that, then the question is one of transition. And what I've been encouraged by is that everybody's at the table on that discussion. You see, the energy companies themselves making their own commitments around, achieving a net zero emission through carbon capture, through diversifying their businesses, through, greening even the legacy energy sources. You see places like Saudi Arabia putting forth. So again, I think that the way I think about it, so I'll just speak for myself, is that there is a path forward here, but it's very delicate, and how we navigate that, I think, is what you're rightly very concerned about, because if the navigating that path disadvantages the economic engine of energy and the economy, then that's a real problem.
Is it Ms. Heinel?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And I love that, that you're right. We're all at the table. My concern as an elected official in Texas, born and raised in Texas, 6 generations,
Coal
more
miner's
from the
daughter
United
here.
States, a long time around, is the disadvantage that we're seeing, and I'm going to go a little more global, the disadvantage for our country as we bend to ESG, where some of our competitors are not. For example, China approved the construction of 8.63 gigawatts of coal power in the first quarter of 2022, nearly half the amount seen in all of 2021. So I'm going to say, my politics are different than China, but I'm just going to say, as a global leader for the United States of America, right here in the county in which we sit, we're going to decommission a coal plant because of ESG scoring, because AEP is being forced to do that to be able to compete to get funds. As Mr. Brigham, I don't even know who that man is, and he came all the way from Austin, and he kind of just put it out there. He's dealing with the same thing. He has to tweet certain political positions. How embarrassing is that? Unethical. Whoever, that's just unethical. That's just absolutely unethical. But having said that, is the position that it is putting the United States of America. So China, Russia, and India are putting their countries, I've said this before today, first. Not only their economies, but their national protection. While we're all bending to some scoring that y'all all sit around a table, and the only way that Texas can fight back is potentially take our marbles and go elsewhere to derail some of these proxy votes, but to also maybe change some of the thinking, and again, keep Texas and this nation at the forefront of a global power. And so I have said this over and over and over again. When other countries adhere to what we're doing or what Europe is doing, let's not forget that Germany, they have I think they're all looking for firewood right now. It's not going to go very well in Germany this winter. It's a developed country. Wow. So when we're talking about this is really important stuff. And I get where y'all are. You're sitting here, and I mean, man, y'all, I don't know how y'all drew straws, but I'm sorry y'all drew this one. Okay? I say, girl power here. Just saying, everyone that's testified today, female, thank y'all. But it really is important that we discuss these, and we discuss them in a public matter. While New York may want something, trust me, Texas wants it different. And the proof is in the pudding where we are economically, okay? And they can do what they want on the East Coast, and they can do what they want on the West Coast, but we're trying to determine for Texas. And I am concluding, I'm not going to try to rush to this conclusion, but I am moving toward a conclusion that your two firms are something that we shouldn't invest in because we have different goals. That's how I'm going to say it. We have different goals. We love our earth. We want to take care of it. But the jury is still out, as I read the other day, that if you don't drive 60,000 miles on a car, that you actually, on an electric car, you actually have a larger carbon footprint than a gasoline or diesel powered car. Now, let me tell you that Senate District 18, you can fit about 3 or 4 of the East Coast states just in my Senate district. And I drive about 30,000 miles, 35,000. I think election year it might have been closer to 40. But I'm not even sniffing 60,000 miles. So the normal person that doesn't have to drive as much as I do won't. So I'm saying that all of these environment, social, and governance, which I'm now going to start just asking the question, is that under the E, the S, or the G? The chairman put up, does pro-life stances become in a company under the social? What about, one day we might get to, are you vaccinated? Do you have vaccination policies? That probably would fit under the S, maybe the G, maybe the E. I don't know. Y'all are going to determine that. And so I'm just going to say again that there are other countries, 8.63 gigawatts of coal power in the first quarter. That's just the first quarter of 2022. And we're over here arguing about how we voted out the directors of ExxonMobil, which is a Texas-based company. I hope that just puts it in perspective. It's maybe time for us to take our marbles, go elsewhere, find other investors, Mr. Chairman, be a little more direct to ERS and TRS, like Florida and a couple other states are doing.
Thank you, Senator. Makes a lot of sense. Senator Hall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator Hall, if you will get that microphone real close so the folks watching on television and the recording can get all this. Thank you.
No. Senator Corcoran, that's exactly in line with the question I'd asked earlier with ISS, that the work's out of alignment here, and I see things that are being talked about with no real credible rationale behind why that's a good idea that we're doing this. I still would like to ask the question of both of you that I ask of ISS, where is the empirical data that supports that net zero is good for the bottom line, that actually would improve income, improve revenue, and the rest of the things that are stuck in that woke analysis that's done? Where is the empirical data that says this will actually be a benefit to the investment by doing this? I hear talk about it, I hear do this and do that, but I've yet to hear or see anything written that says here's our analysis that says that this will result in more revenue. This will invest at lower risk in there. And it's like the senator said, we're finding the issues about green energy, the problems we're going to have with the wind power. We're not going to be able to store the blades. I mean, those blades are a threat to our environment. The construction, all the concrete and steel and construction, it gets left out of the carbon analysis, and they just pretend that it only exists once it's in place and the blades are turning. The analysis that ignores the manufacturing and the disposal process of solar panels. Huge impact to the environment. Huge impact that gets left out. So we're going to run around and say, oh, this is low carbon impact. It's not. It's a lie. But it's being used that has a tremendous impact on our country and our state here. And so that's our great concern. And I agree with, look, New York can do whatever they want to do. And the crazy coast can do whatever they want to do. But this is Texas. And we do things a little bit different here. We happen to believe in the truth. We happen to believe in honesty. And we believe in having real objectives that we're trying to achieve. And so I would like to see the written analysis that shows that, wow, each one of these is going to be a net benefit because, and I'll show whatever analysis you use to arrive at doing this.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just a few points. I would love to answer the senator's question. Just a few other points, if I may.
Try to answer the questions. That'd be good.
Thank you. So, Senator, we have done research in this space, and based on our research, and this is data analytics, we believe that an orderly transition to a low carbon economy is much more beneficial for our clients' portfolios. A disorderly transition can cost the global economy about a 25% reduction in GDP, which would impact our clients' portfolios. So we've actually done research in this space and how it could potentially impact our clients' portfolios in the long term. The serving two masters comment really struck me, Senator, because for us at BlackRock, we have one master, and that's our client. It's our North Star. And being a fiduciary to them and providing them with the best risk-adjusted returns we can. And we are really proud of the performance that we have generated right here in Texas for our Texas clients. And not just as an asset manager to them. Many of them have actually been holders of our public stock since we went public back in '99. We went public at $14 a share. The clients that have stuck with our shareholding as of last week, what they gained is 7,700% return holding BlackRock stock. We are a success story. We're in the top of the S&P 500, top 20. In the top 20 of the S&P 500, we are really proud of what we have delivered to our shareholders, including many right here in Texas, and to our investors in terms of the performance in Texas. We have beaten the active benchmarks for 5 years. You know, with that, I'm going to come back to choice. That the way that you address the needs of unique clients who have different views, sir, be it New York or California or right here in Texas, is that you provide them with the choice to make sure that you are meeting their needs. But right here in Texas, and when we have $107 billion invested in the public energy companies. We've invested in Texas Energy just the past 2 years, $31 billion. We believe in these investments. We do not boycott oil and gas. We look for investment opportunities. We've just invested this past year, this past summer. We believe in these investments. They're very, very important to us. And the final point, sir, if you just indulge me, I apologize. I know I'm talking a lot, but I do want to come back to Florida, sir, and the comment there. BlackRock outperformed the benchmark for 5 years. And the number one ranked firm versus us, the difference was less than a quarter percentage point, less than a quarter. This is how tight these are.
Yet Florida chose to fire you for the reasons that Senator Beckcourt read to us. We'll get back to that later. I want to talk to you about a coal plant right here, just down the road, that you guys, we believe, are engaged with. We mentioned this once or twice already. Just to be clear, a few miles from here, there's a power plant that this community relies on for jobs and for electricity, that Texas relies on for jobs and for electricity. It's called the Perky Power Plant. SWEPCO, a regional company, a respected company here, has had it for a while. It's owned. The parent company is now AEP, American Electric Power, which BlackRock is very engaged with, based on documents we've seen. Now, according to AEP, they're going to close that plant in 2023. It has decades of life based on its technology, based on the coal that's there. It's a workhorse. It provides clean, reliable energy, keeps the lights on, provides good jobs, not just the power plant, but the mine that's attached where the lignite is mined. And so, according to AEP, this parent company, over 200 jobs will be directly lost as a result. And then for every job lost, 2 or 3 jobs lost in the economy. Good, high-paying jobs, especially in days like these. Our school districts lose tremendous tax base and tens of millions of dollars to local communities. So AEP is closing the Perky Power Plant as part of its plan to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The Sabine Mine, whose only customer is the Perky Power Plant, they don't support the closure. In fact, their parent company, North American Coal, says that the Perky Power Plant, quote, is a reliable and resilient asset, and the continued long-term operation of the facility is in the best interest of our employees, the local community, region, and state. So here's my question. Did BlackRock engage, and I'm using the euphemism engage, did BlackRock engage with AEP about its retirement of the Perky Power Plant?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know about that specific question. I do know that we have supported management of AEP in the past several years of proxy seasons.
Isn't AEP one of your Climate Action 100 focus companies?
Sir, we have
Climate Action 100 means that as part of your responsibilities, different asset managers focus on different companies. Isn't AEP one of your focus companies for Climate Action 100?
we have our own a climate universe of companies that we focus on.
So AEP is not one of your focus companies under Climate Action 100?
I would have to get back to you on that specific one. I know we have our own climate focus group, which is on our website.
I can represent to you that Climate Action 100 says AEP is one of your focus companies. As you know, Climate Action 100 assesses utility companies based on whether they've assigned a retirement date to each and every coal unit with a full phase-out by 2040. Now, that's what Climate Action 100 says. And I know we've talked about this, but I'm not going to apologize for reading your words, your company's words, back to you. Now, Climate Action 100 has made this pledge that utility companies have to have a plan, a retirement date for every coal unit with a full phase-out by 2040. Has BlackRock communicated that to AEP?
Sir, I believe you just said you read a pledge from Climate Action 100.
Which you've signed on to. Yes, ma'am.
Sir,
So you're not going to answer my question, are you? Has BlackRock communicated to AEP that Climate Action 100 expects retirement of these coal plants by 2040? Yes or no?
Sir, I would have to get back to you in this specific question, but I will say that when we engage with companies, we engage independently, not on behalf of somebody else's voice. We have the largest stewardship team in the industry. We do our own guidelines. We don't take them from a proxy advisor. We engage independently, and we vote independently to drive governance and performance. On
your website, and I'm not going to apologize to you about reading your website. On your website, it says that it co-leads. Your website says BlackRock co-leads GFANZ's work stream on sectoral decarbonization pathways. Those are your words. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What's GFANZ? GFANZ.
GFANZ.
Tell us what that is.
The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero.
What does that mean when you join that?
It's the same as the other any other group we join. We are joining it to participate in dialogue with other participants on issues that are important to our clients. In this case, the transition to a low-carbon economy.
So to that point, according to GFANZ, a stated goal is, quote, to provide owners of carbon-intensive assets with tools and to incentivize and facilitate asset retirement and decarbonization in line with a science-based net zero pathway. Does that sound right?
Yes, sir.
In fact, didn't BlackRock help author the June 2022 report on, quote, how to facilitate the early retirement of high-emitting assets, unquote?
Is that the sectoral? Yeah, I believe we were work stream co-leads on that work stream.
Says you help write the article. Do you think it's necessary to finance early retirement of a significant amount of high-emitting assets?
Sir, just to perspective around this, the research paper, in the paper that you are referencing, this is a research paper, and the idea behind it and the idea of why it's important to, be participants in organizations like this, it goes through the assumptions that it explores and researches and makes analysis of assumptions that you would have to go through to get to a net zero. And that's important because it enables market participants to understand the cost benefit of these pathways. So this is a research paper that was that the GFANZ organization asked for, commissioned, if you will. And so it runs through assumptions of how you could get there, giving us information.
You say GFANZ asked for it. Your website says you co-lead GFANZ in this department. Isn't that right?
This was a research commissioned by GFANS.
And you're part of GFANS.
We are members of GFANS, correct.
When you write these papers, do you expect people to read them?
Sir, this was not written by BlackRock. We participated in a work stream, and I believe if you look at the document, it has a couple of columns of entities that were participants. We were co-lead in this one, but we did not. This was not a BlackRock paper. It was commissioned by GFANS. It was under GFANS's rubric, and it goes through the assumptions that we believe are important for market participants to understand, but this is not directives to do anything.
Let's just read what you said as a participant, what BlackRock said as a participant in this paper. It says, and I want to ask you if you agree with this. This is relevant to this community and this state and these people in this room.
Yes, sir.
Do you agree that it is best if companies and financial institutions, quote, manage down the greenhouse gas emissions from their portfolios rather than divest and transfer them to someone with less climate ambition? Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir. We don't believe in divestment, and we've been very public about that. Our lack of belief in divestment.
So what that means here, that means GFANS, working with BlackRock, has said it's better to make the companies keep the coal plants and manage them down. That means shut them down rather than sell them to someone else who will keep operating them and keep the power and the jobs coming. That's exactly what that means in this community. And we're seeing that play out, where similar plants have been purchased by investors who wish to continue to operate them. But the decision here is to prematurely shut it down.
Respectfully, Senator, this is about managing carbon emissions, not shutting down plants. By way of example,
Manage down.
Emissions.
Manage down.
Emissions, sir.
Rather than divest and sell to someone with less climate ambition. They don't want to sell the plant to someone who will keep operating and not manage it down, as you so euphemistically state.
May I?
Please. Love to hear it.
Thank you, sir. So managing your carbon emissions, by way of example, we are one of the largest investors in carbon capture with Navigator. We are investing in a carbon capture facility using the old salt mines to put the carbon in there. Managing emissions is not shutting down the pump. Managing emissions is how we can get to net zero, be more efficient in terms of capturing that carbon, but it does not translate into asking them, these companies, to stop producing oil or gas. We continue to be investors, and we have publicly said that we believe they are part of the solution, and the success of these companies is the success of our investors who are invested in them.
Senator Birdwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry. I try not to be too loud. I'm not so much that I have a question for Ms. Blass. What I'm hearing is managing something down to zero. That's kind of like, the doctor lets the patient die and claims success. It's kind of like if, and this has happened to both of us, where we get a bill out of one body and somebody picks it up in the other house, not to actually move it, but to kill it. And so in this sense that BlackRock and State Street, maybe you haven't spoken to this directly, ma'am, so maybe I should, but get to claim they invest in the energy industry so that they don't deal with the boycott aspect, that they're not boycotting industry, but they're functionally malpracticing, in my view, in the sense of letting an energy production system survive and thrive and continue to move if you're letting the patient die. And look, I think the folks that are going to testify later, during Uri almost 2 years ago, about 30 to 32%, if I recall correctly from Senator Hancock's B&C hearings, about 30 to 32% of our electrical power generation in Texas is coal-fired electricity. So, to just simply say, shut the plant down in another year and a half. I mean, I've got rural folks that are sick of seeing solar farms going up on every good piece of ranch land. Maybe that's why we're going to be eating insects instead of, because there's nowhere for the cattle to graze. And you can't sit here and just simply be blind to the aspects and effects and say, you know, you're investing and, you know, and you're managing it down. I mean, you know, if I may speak bluntly, Mr. Chairman, I mean, it's like urinate on my leg and tell me it's raining. You know, I mean, I guess I'm just frustrated being taken for a fool, and we're not sitting up here being foolish. We're scared to death of what you're going to do to our citizens in this state of Texas, and call it the free marketplace. So, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hall, and get close to that microphone.
Again, how do you relate? You say it's managing their carbon emissions down to zero. How do you show that can relate to, if you get them down to zero, your profits are going to go up. The investments are going to be better, if that's what you're trying to do. Because what we're talking about here, they managed it down to zero. It's shut down. It could have been sold to somebody else. But explain to me how that you have an analysis that shows that whatever it takes to do that, you get your down to zero, and your profits are going to go up. Because that's what you said. It's about managing carbons to zero. So please explain that to me, because it escapes me.
We appreciate. I appreciate. This is about people's livelihoods. I really appreciate that. My mother-in-law lives down the I-70. She's a pensioner, 87-year-old retired school teacher on a fixed income. I appreciate the price of gas and what it's doing to a lot of the communities around the United States. I just want to, you know, Senator, Vice Chairman Birdwell, what you said. We are not blind to the effects of this, and no one can be. No one can be, sir.
Well, you may not be.
Wait a minute.
I just want to.
Yes, sir.
Are you working towards an answer? Because nothing you've said so far even closely addresses the question I asked.
I know I am working to an answer, and I apologize, sir. Managing to net zero is essentially making sure that that carbon you're emitting, you're also offsetting that. You're taking that, you know, the carbon out.
So I want to make sure we're clear. You're saying that manage down in the context of a coal-fired power plant. You're saying manage down does not mean move towards shutting down. Come on. We're talking about coal-fired power plants. That's the context here.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. When we're looking at the net zero transition, the transition to a low-carbon economy, we are looking at multiple factors that can move in that direction. From renewable energy that can replace some of the fossil fuels, but also to carbon capture and to making our energy production more and more efficient, which, as you noted, the United States has done that.
Senator, go ahead. Go ahead.
You told us earlier that your objective was to maximize investments. Now you're telling us that your objective is zero carbon emissions. Which is it?
No, sir.
That's what you just said. I mean, twice now I've heard you say that.
No, sir. I was answering what net zero is. Our objective as a fiduciary asset manager is to provide the best risk-adjusted returns for our clients. We do that by looking at the market risks. We do that by looking at market opportunities. Okay. We do that by looking at how the companies are managing their risks. And as the global regulators, including here in the United States, are moving more and more towards a regulatory system around net zero and carbon
yes,
reduction.
You've told us that before.
We look at how they're managing that to make sure that long term they're able to produce results for our clients who rely on the success of these companies.
Okay. I think it's probably about 3 times you've given that kind of answer to various questions. My question is, how does reducing their carbons to zero increase their net worth, their revenues? How does that do it? If what you're going to say, you need to get your carbon emissions to zero, and your objective is to maximize in value, how does that work? What is the analysis that you have that says, Mr. Coal Plant over here, if you'll get your carbon emissions to zero, your net worth is going to go up, your revenue is going to go up, and the whole country is going to prosper from that. Where is the analysis that supports that?
We have done an analysis that shows an orderly market transition to net zero is much better for our clients' portfolios than a disorderly. A disorderly transition to net zero.
What is an orderly transition?
One that is paced out, one that is supportive of communities and not rushed, one that is thought through, if you will. An orderly transition is much better for communities and for our clients' portfolios.
Okay, so if they take 10 years to shut down, that's better than if they shut down in 5 years.
So
is that orderly? Because they get to zero in 10 years instead of getting zero at 5 years. Is that? But the 5 years would be better than the 10 years.
Sir, what we look at is long-term trends. We look at regulations. We look at long-term trends. We look at what companies, how they manage their risks.
But for who? I'm talking about for the plant that you're telling now. You're letting this board know that if you're not going to be voting for zero carbon emissions, we're going to try to get you off the board. So you're trying to get them to zero emissions, and their choice is shut down. Is to shut down. How is that beneficial to the bottom line of that operation?
Sir, we look at macroeconomic trends, and we put out research in that regard. With respect to companies...
I'm not asking you what you look at. I'm just saying it's a real simple, it's not a complicated question. How is requiring a company to go to zero emissions in their best interest to do that from an investment standpoint? What is it says that your company, the one just like the one we got here in Marshall, they're going to be at net zero? How is that will have been in their best interest to go out of business?
Sir, with respect to our engagement with companies, we don't tell them do this or do that. We ask them, how are you managing the risks? What are the material risks to your business? How are you managing these risks?
But why is net zero carbons even one of your concerns about risk that they're managing? What is the risk of not getting to, what is the risk to that company of not getting to zero carbons? I don't even understand why you even have it in your list of questions that you would even ask.
Thank you, Senator. We look at physical and transition risks with respect to climate. So physical risks are things like hurricanes and if a business is impacted. Transition risks include actually regulatory changes and risk by way of example. And as regulators move increasingly to around climate disclosures and climate regulations, we look at how a company is managing against that because we are looking at the long term to generate those long-term returns for our clients. So it's how you're managing your physical risks, how you're managing your transition risks in accordance with your business.
What does zero emissions have to do with anything you just had to say? I understand all of what you said, and I cannot make the connection between getting to zero carbon emissions and a general discussion on risk management. That's exactly what you gave, and I understand risk management. I want to know, what is it specifically about zero emissions that causes you to tell a company that if you want to maximize your asset value, you get to zero emissions?
It's the transition risk, sir, and we don't tell them you have to get to this. We ask them, how are you looking at this in the global economy in terms of the regulatory atmosphere that you are working in, and how are you managing it? But it's the transition risks that impact.
I'm not talking about risk. I'm not talking about risk. I'm asking about end objective. Okay, we get all the master risk managed, and we get to zero emissions. How does that improve their net value, net worth, their assets, their income? They get there. They hand manage everything. I don't talk about transition, whatever. We get there. How is that an advantage from the standpoint of asset value?
Sir, companies operate in a highly regulated environment here in the United States and across the globe, and making sure that they are looking at regulatory changes that could impact their business in the short term, medium term, and long term is important is very important for them to continue to be able to generate this long-term performance, which as fiduciaries is what we're looking for them to do on behalf of our clients.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, you can have it back. I give up. We're not going to get an answer.
Senator Betancourt had one, and then we'll come back to Senator Colcourt. Senator Betancourt.
I just want to say something to the audience here today. There's no fact or supposition of fact that managing down a coal plant means to shut it down. There were workers here this morning. I wish they were here today, this afternoon, because I would say it to you, Senator, that I will do everything I can to help you to keep this plant from being shut down, because it's a symbol of what's wrong with this entire discussion that we've had today. Senator Hall, I laud your efforts to try to get a straight answer. But the straight answer to this back row and everybody else listening is when you talk about a coal plant and you're going to manage it to zero, you're talking about a shutdown. And we don't need these plants to shut down. We have the cleanest coal technology in the country. Senator Colcourt made a comment about the fact that in China they're talking about gigawatts of construction. That's 1,000 times the 5 megawatts that I'll be proposing we need to bring onto the Texas grid. And the order of magnitude and scale is astonishing because it's 3 orders of magnitude. It's 1,000 more, not even counting the digit of it. And so basically what we've seen here today, then I'm going to say this to Senator Birdwell, I don't see how either one of these companies is in compliance with Senate Bill 13. Ladies, you better reconsider your positions because it's, in my mind, an open and shut case that you're not complying with Senate Bill 13. And that has specific financial consequences for everybody involved. And the fact of the matter is that the longer this discussion goes on, the more sure of it I am. Because if you can't tell the truth to a simple question, because you've got a SWEPCO plant that's owned by ADP here, and all the discussion today is managing it effectively down to zero, it means you're going to shut the plant down decades ahead of its economic life. And that's not good for this local area. It's not good for the Texas grid. It's not good for economic reality as I understand it. And with all due respect to all the discussion of market trends and et cetera, okay, we've seen enough evidence to understand that what we're dealing with here are companies that seem to have made up their minds about what we should be doing and in the state of Texas. And I submit that they're incorrect. And that I don't need any more anecdotal evidence. I don't need more direct evidence. I know that they're not following the intent of Senate Bill 13. And I'm going to continue to say it because I don't need to be convinced anymore. I've already heard enough hours of testimony, Chairman. And I think they've been very enlightening. So, ladies, I would encourage you to take back those words and reconsider your positions because I believe Senator Colcourt is correct. You can't serve two masters here. And our intent is clear. And I believe back to Florida, the Governor DeSantis is going to end up with a bill very much similar to Senate Bill 13. And with that being said, Senator, I want to thank you for the invitation to bring us here to talk about this because it was the employees that we are sitting in the back corner of this courtroom are the ones that may have the problem because they're the ones that are going to be directly affected by this type of ESG attitude that has permeated documents, permeated statements, permeates the reality of these two companies that have been testifying on it. And the question is, do we fight for these employees or not? And I may be from Houston, but I'll fight for them because I know this battle's coming to our consumers in Houston when we turn on the light switch and this plant is not there. So I'm willing to fight and already know the answer, and I believe the answer is clearly that State Street and BlackRock are not in compliance with Senate Bill 13. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Colcourt.
Just a quick question. We talked a lot about coal today or later this afternoon. What's your stance on natural gas plants?
So quite honestly, we don't have a stance on any particular business model or any particular energy source. What we have a stance on is that we believe the science that suggests that the globe is warming. We believe the science that suggests that that is in part driven by emissions. So our only interest is in making sure that companies are processing what that might mean for them. And I'll just give an example. Again, I grew up in Pennsylvania. Father was a coal miner. His father was a coal miner. As you all know, the coal mining industry in Pennsylvania was basically decimated. The other side of it, though, is we were very fortunate because the fracking industry took off. And part of what decimated the coal industry was the fact that you could get cheap natural gas to fire the plants. And so it was a combination of some regulatory changes that had happened over many, many years, coupled with new technology. So I share that story because I'm disappointed deeply that, you know, we may walk out of here leaving the impression that somehow we're not aligned. I think we're all aligned towards we want companies to manage those risks. And I would directly answer Mr. Hall's question by saying I have no evidence that this is good for returns in any time frame. In fact, we've seen the evidence quite the contrary. Over the last year, if you didn't own energy companies, you did miserably compared to broad benchmarks. The year before that, it was quite the opposite. If you didn't own energy companies going into the pandemic, it was actually a boon for you. But that was just a happenstance. That's not because it's good investment. So I'll say one final comment, and then I promise you I'll be quiet. So to me, it's about making sure the companies understand the regulatory, the consumer, the physical, the reputational, the physical structure, the operation. If they understand those risks and they're managing them, then we're good.
And I think what hasn't been stated is the obvious is the Green New Deal. I believe it was renamed something like the Inflation Induction.
Inflation Reduction Act.
Whatever that was. That's a great marketing tool. I wish I could. You just can't make that stuff up. But anyway, what you're saying is you're trying to tell your companies that you're investing in, there's $2 trillion out here, go chase it, basically. And, Bob, that's the answer to your question. But as a state senator in the state of Texas, I have to tell you that Uri is fresh on all of our minds. You take a coal plant out of operation, then you are putting us at risk for not meeting the needs. And there is no way that the state of Texas can operate on coal and solar. Zero way that we can do it. I mean, tonight, when the sun sets here, I will tell you how much solar is putting on the grid. It is zero. It is absolutely zero. In fact, on a cloudy day, I'll tell you how much it's putting on. Zero, right?
From Pennsylvania.
And the batteries are not capable of
cloudy
keeping it
days.
up. And once the batteries finally get there, I think they have about 2 hours storage. We can't stack them. Robert Nichols asked if we could stack them. It's a great engineer question. All the things that Bob said, the long-term effects, and where rare earth materials are. And again, I've noted some other countries. I don't see them as enemies. I see them as competitors, no different than TCU in Michigan on December 31st. Maybe slightly different, but they are our competitor. And it is my job to put Texas at the forefront of competing. And we cannot compete with solar and wind. And we saw what happened in Uri, and we came this close this summer, this close in June. And had we not had that coal plant here in Harrison County, we probably would have been without energy. Every one of them had to be firing at its top rate. So for us, we are going to build more dispatchable, what I call base load. And it takes too long to get nuclear. We're going with gas, and we're going to build a bunch of it. So I hope y'all get on. And finally, I'll just leave it with this, that whether it's the World Economic Forum or the Green New Deal, there are standards being set out there that the whole world is not living by. And I'm going to go back to that. I'm elected by people that actually think that every day I wake up 7 days a week is to put their families at the forefront of my mind and represent them and put them in a position, like I said to Senator Lucio, research him. He came from the most humble of beginnings to go on to be a state senator in the state of Texas. It is my job to let every one of my constituents live the American dream, and I view ESG as doing nothing but marginalizing this country that I have been so blessed to have been born into. And so every day I'm going to fight for this. And I'm going to say this again. TRS and ERS, it's time to pick up our marbles and move. And then maybe the state of Texas, who is arguably the richest state right now in the United States of America, will start changing the opinions of investment firms. I really have appreciated y'all being here today. You've been fabulous. You probably should answer some of those a little more directly. But thank you for being here. I look forward to working with y'all. But my job is to put Texas at the forefront, and Texas is in the United States of America, so I'm going to fight for this country too. We have been our own country once. We're very proud here, and we're extremely independent. Extremely. So if I was the New York AG and had as little resources as they did up there, I'd probably say, okay, I'd write a letter like that. We're not. We're not. We are blessed with even rare earth materials. So we're going to do our own thing here, and we're going to do it in a way that puts our constituents at the forefront of being successful and living that American dream. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Birdwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm being too, I don't want to yell. Ladies, thank y'all for joining us today. I think the practical reality of what you've told us in testimony is, whether it's State Street, BlackRock, Vanguard, pick the combination of folks. Look, I'm not one that buys the climate change. I think too much of our conversation in here, I mean, while the committee hearing was not designed to have the argument of the climate changing or not, there are those of us that don't buy it for a lot of different reasons and a lot of facts related to it. But what I don't want to see happen is financial leverage used to basically put dispatchable energy on hospice, because that's what you're functionally doing. You may call it something else, or, investment strategies and the like, but we're not going to put, coal and gas. I've got a nuclear plant in my district. It was the only electric generation in the state of Texas that was unimpacted by Winter Storm Uri. And it's why Dallas and Fort Worth didn't completely freeze to death, because of the nuclear plant in my district. The federal government's already trying to put dispatchable energy on hospice. Texas isn't going to participate in that. Please don't take our tone and our tenor as hostility to you personally. It's not designed that way. But the hard reality is, we don't want, like the citizens of Germany are going to be doing this winter, scraping the woods, grabbing wood, and taking us back to the 1800s, because it is fossil fuels that has made us so prosperous, so productive, so safe, and the like. Wind and solar certainly have a place, but they're not the anchor, they're not the center of gravity. And my center of gravity is my constituents, and to make sure that Texas stays free and strong and prosperous. And I think absolutely that whether what Senator Hall said that about, I guess Senator Colcourt's comment about, I guess at some point we're just going to have to decide to disagree and break contact. And I think that's the direction we probably ought to take as a state, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today.
Senator, thank you. And for the benefit of those who do wish to testify after we're moved from this portion of the hearing, we will need a witness affirmation card filled out, and they are just outside the courtroom, outside those doors, so anybody who wants to testify can testify. A few more questions about voting while you're here and while we're on the topic. And so, Ms. Heinle, going back to State Street, we're going to look at another document just to make sure we understand and that we understand what you're telling us and what State Street's position is. And so there's a document from 2022 entitled Energy Transition, Fast Forward or Slow Down. We'll grab that. You got that. It's 7963. I can give you some background. This was prepared by someone at State Street for a summit held a few months ago, June of this year. Does that look familiar to you?
I've not seen this particular presentation, but I do know we shared it with you, so I know the individual and I'm familiar with the content broadly.
Thank you. So we're going to go to page 2 of this document, and it says on the second page, it says oil prices are set to remain relatively high over the medium term given supply scarcity. And then it says a focus on decarbonization by many of the oil majors may constrain their investment. Tell us what's meant by that.
Yeah. So just for context, the person who presented this, Esther Brody, is a portfolio manager in one of our active strategies. She is located in London, and her job is to deliver alpha for clients. So she looks at all of these issues through the lens of the financial impact to a company and ultimately whether it's a good investment. So my understanding of what she would mean when she says those words is that there are pressures, certainly in Europe, which is where she is, to decarbonize, which again, as Vice Chairman Birdwell has rightly noted, has not served them well, particularly given the intensity of the energy crisis with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But the basis of her whole thesis is that energy companies are going to be continually getting pressure from regulators in Europe where there's this acute interest in divesting, for example, and they need to be able to respond to that.
With that, let's take a look at the annual Climate Stewardship Review from 2020. It came out in October. We'll pull that up for you, and again, this is your department, one of the many things you're responsible for.
Yes, sir.
And so we're going to go down to page 7 of this document. And at the top, it notes that Climate Action 100 supported 12 shareholder proposals in 2020. And those 12 proposals are listed on the chart on pages 7 and 8. So let's look at page 8. And it talks about one category of these proposals which relate to, quote, lobbying for a policy framework alignment with the Paris Agreement, unquote. So is it correct that these proposals direct companies to align their lobbying and their trade association membership with implementing the Paris Agreement?
Well, so again, the context for a lot of this is that right now it's a bit of the Wild West in this space. So different jurisdictions are imposing, in some cases, quite draconian disclosure requirements or expectations. And again, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony this morning, there are even some proposals being circulated within the United States that would be quite extreme in terms of what it would require companies to disclose. It'd be quite labor intensive for them to do it. There's no common framework for how to, calculate some of these things like Scope 3 emissions, for example. So again, the spirit of this, and I'm trying to quickly read exactly the words, was in this context of companies need to participate in the process too, to make sure that there is coherence and that the costs of complying with these kinds of regulatory requirements are not undue burdens for them.
So then it sounds like you're saying this is directing companies to lobby against aggressive climate
so there,
policy, because it reads like like the opposite of that.
Yeah.
So we'd like to understand that.
So there are two pieces. So one is that, as we mentioned earlier, many of these companies themselves have put forward their own net zero aspirations. And so there, again, we are supportive of, and I've said this, that there is a climate impact and there is a greenhouse gas emissions, or at least in part, contributing to that. So that is our posture. I recognize not everybody believes that, but that is our posture. Many of these companies have themselves also adopted that posture. So one piece of it is they've often made their own commitments, and then the question really is, how do we manage through how the regulatory environment is going to evolve to require disclosure, reporting. And there are some extreme examples where some jurisdictions want a lot of very detailed reporting on these things. We think that would be counterproductive because it would be very expensive for companies to comply. It could be quite complex because you might have different jurisdictions wanting different things, and it won't help investors because they won't have a clear body of reliable information to judge.
To be clear,
Yes, sir.
this language, and I realize we're skipping around, but this language is about encouraging companies to lobby in a certain direction.
On behalf of the disclosure, yes, sir.
Are you concerned that companies are going to lobby to move too quickly toward net zero, and you want to slow them down? I'm genuinely confused. I want to understand.
So it's not about lobbying toward net zero. It's about lobbying towards the disclosures that they'll have to abide by as they make their commitments.
Okay, and we'll see this language in some of the votes, but it says lobbying for a policy framework alignment with the Paris Agreement. And to be clear, Paris Agreement's about a whole lot more than disclosure. Wouldn't we agree with that?
It is.
Wouldn't
yes.
BlackRock agree with that? Mm-hmm. Yes? Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's move on, and I think this will make more sense. But to be clear, whatever direction this is taking, this is saying that Climate Action 100 should be directing companies and how they exercise their lobbying, how they exercise their political speech. Whatever the message is, that's what that says, right?
And again, it's because we're trying to get their voice into how these issues get disclosed, reported on, and to make sure that there's coherence globally around how these things happen to reduce the cost and the burden of complying with that disclosure.
Many of the members of Climate Action 100 are foreign asset managers and asset owners. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And this directive is about the lobbying and political speech of American companies. Isn't that right?
Well, it's all companies globally, so we engage with companies globally, not just in the U.S.
Does it affect the political speech and lobbying of American companies?
It would, yes, sir. Yes.
16089. We got 16089. I've got a spreadsheet that you provided to us, and I know we have a lot of documents, but you're probably aware State Street provided this committee with a document that contains notes about its engagements related to certain companies, including Chevron. That document has a row 54 that talks about a May 4th, 2020 call regarding Chevron between Michael Jonas at SSGA and Adam Kanzer, who is the head of stewardship at BNP Paribas, how do we say that? Paribas. I knew that. I read that somewhere. BNP Paribas. So you're familiar with BNP Paribas.
I am, yes.
And with Mr. Kanzer.
I don't know him personally, but I know Michael Eunice on my team.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
very good. And the label on this row is engaging for voting purpose, engagement for voting purpose. And the notes regarding this call say this: new type of proposal, 10 years of traditional lobbying proposals. This proposal is different and focuses on exclusively the alignment with the Paris Agreement. Proposal asks board to conduct an evaluation and report on its lobbying, including misalignment with these activities. Paris Agreement is imperative, and failure to achieve presents a critical systemic risk to all of our portfolios. Trade associations play an outsized role here, and we need to make sure that the lobbying activities of these organizations are in alignment with Paris. Did I read that right?
Again, I don't have it right in front of me, but that sounds, I believe you. Yes, that's true.
Okay. So why is State Street Global Advisors coordinating with BNP Paribas about taking action on Chevron's lobbying and Chevron's membership in trade associations?
So I don't know the details of that particular engagement, so I can get back to you. But again, the context that we do this in is to make sure that they are getting their voice out around what their commitments are, because in many cases these companies have already made commitments. They are going to need to report and disclose those commitments, and it's in all of our best interests to make sure that there's a coherent framework through which they can do that.
So this is to help Chevron lobby in favor of what's good for its shareholders, or to encourage, manage, engage Chevron to lobby in favor of more Paris Accord results? They're very different, and
They're
very
very
different.
different
And I
things,
think
and-
it's clear, but I'd like to know what you think.
Yeah, so again, my view is not that they are lobbying per se for more draconian emissions restrictions. That's not what we're asking to lobby for. They've already made commitments of what their future pathway is. It's in their interest, it's in our interest, it's in the shareholders' interests to make sure that everybody's clear about how they're going to disclose those commitments, what the regulatory framework is against that, and to have coherence and consistency in that regulatory framework. Otherwise, what you get is they're spending a lot of time figuring out how they're going to report to the U.S. government, how they're going to report to the U.K. government, how they're going to report to the Singapore government. Everywhere they have operations, they might have a different reporting schema, which would be very confusing for investors.
What you described is noble, and I understand alignment of those reporting processes. This is not saying that. This is talking about Chevron's lobbying and Chevron's participation in trade associations, and making sure that the lobbying activities of the trade associations are in alignment with Paris. Isn't that what it says?
It does, and again, it's where it's very nuanced. I would stand by, we are not encouraging companies to specifically lobby around target setting. They have to own their targets. They have to have the pathways of how they're going to get there. But the intersection with how they're disclosing that, what the regulatory frameworks are that require and mandate that disclosure, that's quite fluid, and we're all, I think, trying to come to some framework that will be implementable, provide the information investors need, and be manageable for the companies.
So to be clear,
Yes, sir.
you are not encouraging Chevron to lobby and for Chevron's trade associations to lobby in accordance with the Paris Accords.
Counsel, we're not asking them to lobby on behalf of a specific net zero target, ever. We're not asking them to lobby in favor of a specific net zero target. That's not what we do. We do ask them to engage in the same dialogue we're having today. What are the implications of a commitment that I, as a company, made this commitment? So Chevron made commitments. How do they then evidence those commitments? What regulatory framework, what disclosure framework? That's, and again, counsel, anything else that I'm missing?
Do you really think you have to ask them to lobby in their own interests and for their trade associations? It's a rhetorical question. We can keep going. You can answer if you want to.
No, I'll pass if it's okay. I think I've answered as best I can, sir. Sorry.
BNP Paribas, they were coordinating this action with part of Climate Action 100 based on the correspondence we read about with your company. Isn't that right, with your firm?
I believe that to be true, yes, sir.
BNP Paribas, part owned by the Belgian government, is that right?
I think of them as a French company, but so they may be owned partly by Belgium. I'm not sure, but I do think of them as a French domiciled entity.
Did you perform any analysis to determine whether their motivations were financial or maybe intended to advance a foreign government's policy agenda?
I did not look at that specifically, no, sir.
What's the financial basis for saying, for Chevron in particular, not for the global economy, not for the common good, but for Chevron in particular, what's the basis for saying Paris Agreement is imperative and failure to achieve presents a critical systemic risk to all of our portfolios?
So again, keep in mind that these are companies that have made those commitments independently. They are, in some cases, bound by those commitments in jurisdictions or geographies that they operate in, and they have a requirement to be able to evidence that they are complying. That's whether we were involved in the picture or not. That's the framework.
I want to talk to you about some Delta and United Airlines lobbying and voting. We've talked about climate lobbying proposals and we talked about Chevron. There were also votes for Delta and United Airlines that you were involved with. And then those were 2020. 2021, this came up again for Delta and for United Airlines. Now, both in 2020 and 2021, you'll probably recall that Delta's board and United's boards recommended against this proposal. Is that your recollection?
That's my recollection.
And that's what happened. And again, despite those recommendations, State Street again voted in favor of the proposals. And this time, and the second time, those proposals passed, didn't they?
I believe that to be true, yes, sir.
And these were both supported by Climate Action 100. In fact, the one for Delta was introduced by BNP Paribas Asset Management. Is that your recollection?
I don't recall the details of that, who originated that, but I believe that that's true, yes.
Well, there was a call in May of 2020 between SSGA, your firm, and Adam Kanzer at BNP Paribas Asset Management about climate lobbying proposal. That was in May of 2020. Do you know if State Street again agreed to coordinate with BNP Paribas on these votes in 2021?
So I don't know the details of whether there was that kind of activity. Again, we ultimately vote our own analysis, and we vote based on what we believe is in the interest of shareholders.
Now, you probably know this, but I think folks here might be interested just in case. After those Delta and United votes, which passed over the objection of management, after those votes, Climate Action 100 and Ceres issued a press release, and they said these votes were a major victory for them. In fact, the first person quoted in the press release was Mr. Kanzer, and he said, corporations have a significant impact on climate policy directly and through their trade associations. This string of majority votes is strong recognition by investors that these efforts must be fully aligned with the well below 2 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement. Does that sound familiar?
It does, yes.
Does that sound like this guy is bragging that these votes were taken, and it's a wonderful goal because now we're fully aligning to get to this well below 2 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement? Is there any other way to interpret that?
No, sir. And again, I would just lean. Yeah, it's not our statement. That's, yeah. No. It wasn't our statement. I'm being advised not to comment. It's
I understand.
not our statement.
But you're part of Climate Action 100.
We are, yes, sir.
This press release went on. Ceres, a founding partner of Climate Action 100, and ICCR helped coordinate support for the proposals among North American investors. ICCR launched a concerted initiative in 2020 to spur companies to disclose and align their lobbying activities and their trade association memberships with the goals of the Paris Agreement, unquote. Do you know, after joining Climate Action 100, how many of the climate lobbying proposals State Street voted for in 2021?
So I don't have the precise numbers, but what I can share is that our voting record has been quite consistent. If you look at before we voted or before we joined Climate Action 100 and post, as a general rule, we voted with management about 80% of the time, and that was fairly consistent, in part because we're not being very prescriptive in the way we expect them to adjudicate their responsibilities and their business plans. Rather, it's more of a framework and how we engage with them. So the act of joining Climate Action 100 did not really change the overall support that we had for management in the energy space.
Thank you. The information we have shows that after formally joining Climate Action 100, State Street supported 8 out of 10 climate lobbying proposals in 2021. Do you know how many of those 8 that...
I don't have that detail in front of me. I'm sorry.
No problem. We'll
have to get back to you.
It'll speak for the record. Go ahead, please. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying I don't have that specific detail that you're referencing. I have a different stat, so we'll have to reconcile that for you, sir.
Does your record show, as mine, that every climate action vote that State Street took was opposed by management. In 2021, our records show they were all opposed by management.
Again, I don't have that in front of me. I'll have to get back to you, sir.
Thanks. In the second quarter stewardship activity report, we'll pull it up for you. It's your second quarter 2021 stewardship activity report. We're going to take a look at that. It has some votes involving Phillips 66, for America and certainly for our area. So on page 5. Do you remember the document I'm talking about?
Again, I'm familiar with all these documents. I don't remember exactly every detail, but yes, I'm familiar with the documents.
No problem. On page 5, it discusses a vote on Scope 3 emissions reduction targets for Phillips 66 in 2021. And if you look at page 4 above this table, you'll see where it says requested companies to expand emissions reduction targets beyond Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So above the table, right, requested companies to expand emissions reductions targets beyond Scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Can you just go down a little bit? Because I think it says there that it says for this reason we voted against the proposal requesting the company adopt Scope 1, 2, and 3 targets, sir.
No, we're getting to it.
Okay,
We just want to give you the context for it. Thanks. And so State Street said about this vote, Phillips 66 has not yet adopted any greenhouse gas emissions targets. We believe greenhouse gas emissions are a material risk for the sector and supported the proposal to bring the company better in line with peers, recommendations and our climate expectations. We also believe that Phillips 66, one of the largest U.S. refiners, is well positioned to lead other midstream and downstream operators in adopting such commitments. Is that right?
Yes, yes. And again, this is all related to their disclosure and them being, leaders amongst their peers so it's all around disclosure. Yes, sir.
Well, to be clear, the first statement I read, so I'm quoting, Phillips 66 has not yet adopted. It doesn't say disclosed.
Right,
it says has not yet adopted greenhouse gas emissions targets.
Fair point.
And respectfully, in response to a number of questions, there's been an obfuscation of requiring targets to be set and requiring that they be disclosed. So thank you for
That's fair.
staying
I
with us.
understand. Yeah. So yes, and so in this particular case, they had not even adopted the targets. That's fair. Yes, sir.
And so the reference is to be better in line with peers. Now, in a moment about Chevron, you spoke about Chevron's peers, and you specifically referred to European companies. We'll get to that. But who are the peers that you're trying to bring Phillips 66 in line with?
Well, it would be the entire energy universe, which would include companies around the globe, including those in the United States. Yes, sir.
Why is bringing Phillips 66 in line with its peers in the best interest of Phillips 66 shareholders?
Well, again, our view is that companies need to have a plan for how they are navigating the transition, and companies that are more thoughtful about that plan, including having their own targets of what they plan to do and what they don't plan to do, and then disclosing those, will be able to manage that transition better.
Disclosing as well as adopting, not just disclosing, right?
So first, understand their risks as it relates to the transition. So what are their physical assets today? What businesses are they in? What markets do they serve? All those things. So it starts with their business model, their business strategy, and then the question we ask them to ask themselves is, what are my risks as they relate to the transition? And what does that mean in terms of commitments that I as a company will set? And then how will I be able to evidence that over time through disclosure and through measurement?
So on page 5, there's a reference to a proposal in 2021, which State Street voted for, to again require Phillips 66 lobbying to be in accord with the Paris Agreement. And we differ over what that means, but do you see where I'm reading?
I do, yes,
Okay.
sir.
And again, Phillips 66 board opposed that proposal, didn't they?
I believe that to be the case, yes, sir.
Well, the record will show that they did. What financial analysis did State Street perform before voting contrary to the management recommendation on this proposal?
Yeah, so again, we would have conducted analysis around what their peers do, what information we would expect investors to have available to them, and if investors don't have the information available to be able to make assessments, then we would typically vote against because we think it's important to have that disclosure and that information transparency. It's a principles-based argument, so it's not that we necessarily are doing a lot of financial analysis on the actual plan they've put in place. It's more about, are they giving us as investors the transparency of what that plan is, why they think it's going to be a good plan for them, and then how are they going to report on that through time.
Are they setting goals you like and being transparent about those goals?
Are they setting any goals, sir? Are they setting any goals? And again, the answer could be we have zero commitment, we have zero target, and here's why. We might not like that, but that would be their prerogative at that stage.
And what would be the consequences of that?
Well, we would likely vote against them because we would likely want to see a more planful path forward through the transition. Yes, sir.
So respectfully, what we're saying is you're saying to the company, you can do whatever you want, but we're going to vote all our shares against you if you don't do what we want.
Well, if you don't have a plan that we believe is credible and that addresses the transition pathway. Yes, sir.
Now, according to Climate Action 100, this campaign about Phillips 66 lobbying and its trade associations was led by CalSTRS, which we've spoken about before. You know, of course, that's the California government agency.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, I know them. Yes.
How did State Street determine it was in Phillips 66 shareholders' best interest for a California government agency to dictate Texas companies' corporate speech? That's perplexing to us. It's troubling to us.
So I appreciate that. This is perhaps the nuance of how some of these organizations work, and you talked about it earlier as well. There are initiatives, and various of the members kind of take the lead on those initiatives. So in that particular case, CalSTRS had been in the position to take that lead.
Does State Street think it's good policy for California to limit Texas companies' political speech?
No, sir. We don't believe it's in the best interest of anybody to limit anybody's political speech.
Was voting with CalSTRS to limit their political speech about maximizing shareholder returns or about supporting California's political goals?
Our only interest in all of this is to make sure that these companies have thought through credibly their transition pathways, that they are lobbying for coherent and achievable disclosures, and that they are complying with those disclosures through time.
Have you reviewed CalSTRS communication with State Street regarding this vote?
I've not looked at that, no.
Will you do that for us?
Yes, of course.
Will you share that with us?
Absolutely.
Don't need a written request for that?
No, sir.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
We really would like to know what blue state pension funds are telling you to do with Texas companies. This is a big deal. And so we look forward to seeing those documents.
Of course.
We're talking about the Chevron vote, and while we're on that, while we're in this area, page 4 of that same stewardship activity report from second quarter 2021, page 4, that's 5080, Drew. It discusses State Street voting for a proposal in 2021 to require disclosure of reduction targets covering Scope 3 emissions for Chevron. Item 4 on the proxy card. You got that? Now, you probably remember this, and it won't surprise anyone that Chevron's board recommended against this proposal, didn't they? Is that right? But State Street voted for the proposal. Is that right?
That's correct, and I will also, I'm sure you have this as well, in 2022, we actually did vote with all management and board proposals, and we specifically called out the progress that Chevron had made over the prior year, and we retain a very strong engagement relationship with the company.
We're pleased that as Texas and other energy states have shown a light on these matters, that things have developed in a different direction. We're glad about that. Let's talk about this 2021 vote for
Yes, sir.
now, though. Thanks for sharing that. We'll get to that in just a moment. The report from State Street says, quote, as a major U.S. integrated oil and gas company, we believe that setting time-bound Scope 3 targets, not just disclosing, but setting time-bound Scope 3 targets and outlining steps to achieve such targets would not only bring Chevron better in line with European peers, but also help lead the U.S. industry in establishing Scope 3 disclosure and targets as market practice. Did I read that right?
You did, sir, yes.
And so you mentioned before that the energy market is worldwide. Why are we specifically wanting to be in line with our European peers?
It's a global business, sir, and so in general, we look at these operations as they're global peers, and they operate in many of the same markets, and so we believe that it's useful for them to look at their peer universe globally. Yes, sir.
Well, just to be clear, this doesn't say global peers. It says European peers.
I understood. The intention is all peers, so I respect that it says they're European. The point is that we look at these energy companies as global players. They are all global players at that level.
Is HSBC a European peer that you're interested in pushing this direction?
Well, again, HSBC would operate amongst the financial services businesses globally, so they would be in the peer group with JP Morgan and other major lenders, Citibank, et cetera. So yes, HSBC would be a global peer in the financial services world. Yes, sir.
Looking back at the spreadsheet of engagements, that's 16089, Council. Looking back to that spreadsheet of engagements, I'm going to go to an October 13, 2021 engagement. And again, this is on that spreadsheet, row 46, where State Street had a call with the chairman and CEO of Chevron. It appears that this call was at the request of Chevron following the proxy season and the vote that we just talked about. And these notes reflect that State Street told Chevron, quote, SSGA, and that's State Street Global Advisors, that's you, right? State Street wants to see a pathway on how to get to a lower carbon economy. Is that right?
That's right.
So
And
that's
again,
not just about disclosure, is it?
No, sir. And again, it's all in this context of the belief system we've talked about, and the energy companies need to our view that they want to participate in the transition to that. Yes, sir.
So, did State Street tell Chevron we want to move to a lower carbon economy so that they could maximize returns for Chevron stockholders?
So it's a little more circuitous than that. So I've been on record, and I will say again, I don't believe that ESG factors per se drive long-term return. I do believe, and we do believe, that ESG exposures have risks that need to be mitigated and managed, but price matters, right? So the actual performance of the company through time will be based on a lot of factors. But what we have said, I think, consistently is that we believe that these companies need to participate in the transition, and that those companies that are more proactive about understanding how their businesses are going to evolve, managing that transition, and providing the disclosure and the information to investors to make sound decisions, that those companies will be best in class in that regard.
The notes on this same vote say, in the context of scenario planning, that, quote, China may need to bring coal into the fold to support their growth. Remember that?
Yes.
So just so we're clear, while State Street is pushing Chevron to create, quote, a pathway on how to get to a lower carbon economy, unquote, it's also recognizing that China needs to increase coal power generation. Is that right?
It's recognizing. We are not advocating that. We just recognize that for lots of unfortunate reasons, they're at a stage in their maturation where they're still dependent on very dirty fossil fuels that we would ideally like to see them transition from.
Do you know how much new coal power China built in 2021? No, different numbers.
No. Oh, okay. Sorry.
33 gigawatts.
Yeah.
You know how
It's
much we have in
large.
Texas today?
It's nothing.
We have
compared to
18, barely half that.
that. Yeah. And again, we've been quite on record to say that the best way to manage greenhouse gas emissions in the shorter term, it would be to convert coal-fired facilities in places like India and China to natural gas or other less dirty fuel sources.
And at the risk of stating the obvious, coal plants in America are a whole lot different, a whole lot cleaner, a whole lot safer
I know
than
that
Chinese.
intrinsically.
Isn't that correct? Than
That
Chinese
is
coal
absolutely
plants.
correct. But again, I'm just saying, just as an example, you can make a lot bigger impact on the greenhouse gas emissions globally if places like China and India were to adopt cleaner coal technology, natural gas, or other cleaner burning fossil fuels. We've been on record saying that repeatedly.
Records we have indicate that State Street has over 3,000 employees in China. Does that sound about right?
That is correct, yes.
Has the Chinese government ever attempted to influence State Street's decisions in this area?
No,
The
sir.
area
Not
of
that I'm
voting,
aware of,
of
no,
U.S.
sir.
companies voting,
No, sir, we do
taking
not.
action?
No, sir.
Not that you're aware of or no?
Not that I'm aware of, no, sir.
Can we ask you to check on that for us?
We can absolutely ask you to.
We'd
yeah.
like to know, has the
Yep.
Chinese government ever attempted to influence any of your corporate decision-making?
Okay, we'll get back to you on that. Not to my knowledge, but we'll get back to you on that. And
Do you need that in
when
writing, or
here-
is this verbal request sufficient?
Yeah, we'll double.
No,
we-
you
we
won't
think the
tell
answer-
us, or-
No, we think the answer is that no, they haven't influenced us in any way, but we will confirm that and get back to you.
Have they attempted to, and if so, were they successful? Two separate questions. If you can certify that to us in writing, that would help a lot.
Sure, absolutely.
And by the way, this Chevron vote was a pretty big deal to a lot of people. Climate Action 100 put out a press release, and they called it a day of reckoning. Remember that? The Climate Action put out a press release. The day of reckoning, of course, that has some biblical connotations, but the idea is, I understand, a time when past mistakes or misdeeds must be punished or paid for. And again, that was a Climate Action 100 press release. Your firms are both members of Climate Action 100, and I understand that's sometimes convenient. Today, it's real inconvenient, but you're members of Climate Action 100. So isn't the point of inflicting a day of reckoning on companies so that they'll just do whatever Climate Action 100 wants going forward?
That is very unfortunate language choice.
Was bringing about this day of reckoning to maximize returns for Chevron shareholders, many of them retired teachers in Texas?
I respect that completely. And again, my interest, our interest is in making sure that companies are aware of the risks and that they are navigating the transition. They are disclosing that to investors. Again, that type of reference is unfortunate language, in my opinion.
Day of
That's
reckoning.
just the opinion of Lori Heinel, not the opinion of State Street, for the record, sir.
Thank you. A day of reckoning quote in that Climate Action 100 press release. You know who they were quoting? They were quoting an employee of CalPERS, that same California agency we've been talking about so much today, and having so much concern about them influencing Texas companies and Texas money.
If I may, sir,
Please.
I think this is part of the delicate threading we're all trying to do, and I've heard your views on this from some of the members. There are jurisdictions, right, if you look at, again, I referenced Europe a little bit ago, that are going to continue to have expectations of companies that do business in their worlds. That's part of what we're trying to make sure companies are processing, integrating into their strategy, and then ultimately disclosing. So it is in part because of this wide range of views that we're all dealing with globally that we think it's so important that companies understand the implications for their businesses and manage that.
On ExxonMobil, a
Yes,
little
sir.
bit more about free speech and trade associations, because well, you can help us explain what State Street meant when it made these statements, I hope. The 2021 Proxy contest, ExxonMobil Corporation, Council, that's 5921, SSGA 0005921. This is a bulletin that State Street put out specific to the Exxon Mobil votes in 2021. Do you remember that in general?
I remember those very well, yes,
Sure.
sir.
And by the way, thank you for your patience and your recall. We are never trying to get you to agree with things you don't remember. We're doing our best to pull
No,
the
this one
documents
I
up. so
remember
thank you.
intimately. Actually, was part of the conversations with the Exxon management in this particular case, which I do not always participate, but given the sensitivity of this particular one, I was part of that conversation.
And this is, Senator Cole, of course, was asking me about this particular vote with Exxon. It got a lot of attention. And so SSGA, State Street, put out this vote bulletin specific to that vote. Now, State Street, you guys supported those two dissident candidates.
We did indeed, yes,
Is
sir.
that right?
That's right.
Kaiser Hayatala and Alexander Karstner. Does that sound
That's
right?
correct, yes.
All right. Page 1, at the end of the third paragraph, it says the basis of State Street's vote was, quote, to oversee the implementation of a more disciplined approach to capital allocation as well as greater focus on the company's energy transition strategy. Did I read that right?
You did, and in that context, because I remember this quite vividly, it's making sure that we believe that the directors had the appropriate experiences and skills to be able to oversee company management's strategy in that regard.
And this effort, again, was led by Climate Action, was done through, coordinated through Climate Action 100, isn't that right?
I don't recall it being that way. This was a very intensive engagement that we had in our own right with Exxon.
Oh, well, Climate Action 100 is taking credit for it, but again...
Well, again, the extreme views were to elect more board members on the dissident slate than what we voted for. We were a more tempered vote on that particular vote.
Well, Climate Action 100, whom you, of which you remember, says it was coordinated through them, and of course led by our friends at CalPERS. But page 2 of this document, State Street voted for 2 shareholder resolutions that Exxon's board recommended against. The first was Proposal 6, which sought to require an audited report on how the IEA net zero 2050 scenario would impact ExxonMobil. Now, based on his proxy statement, Exxon's board opposed this proposal. They said Exxon had already analyzed scenarios with lower oil and gas demand than required by that scenario, so it was unnecessary. So why did State Street vote for this proposal after what Exxon's board said? They'd already analyzed an even lower threshold, so why that?
And again, my recollection at the time was that we wanted to have a standard that was in the sort of the assessment at the time, and that it was valuable to have common reporting, common disclosure that would be across comparable across companies.
The second proposal that State Street supported over the opposition of Exxon management was Proposal 10. And that was to require Exxon to report on climate lobbying. You and I have talked about this a lot, and it's gotten a little clearer as we've played through the documents, and thank you for helping us through it. So it's about climate lobbying. Now, based on the proxy statement, this was issued by BNP Paribas, which is coordinating Climate Action 100 efforts to require U.S. companies lobbying to be in accord with the Paris Agreement, as you and I spoke about a few minutes ago. Now, Exxon's board opposed this proposal. And based on the proxy statement, Exxon's board said participation in trade associations enables the company to effectively advocate positions it supports, shares its views with other companies, and influence trade association policy debates. It also said the proposal was unnecessary. So Exxon said this proposal will limit our participation in trade associations and our advocating for positions we agree with. And given what Exxon's board said, I would think State Street would agree. But what did y'all do on that vote?
Yeah, and again, it's about the disclosure. We wanted to know how are they lobbying, who are they lobbying, what are they lobbying for? It was about their willingness to disclose their lobbying activities and report on that.
What's an R factor score?
So we've developed our own internal ESG score, which is a synthesis of a variety of third-party metrics. And I think we talked earlier about this, that the ESG scores are very opaque. They're quite they're different based on who the provider is rather. And so what we attempted to do a couple of years ago was take several of these industry-leading scores and consolidate them so that investors could have a kind of compendium, if you will, a shortcut to say if one, provider has a 59 for a company, another one has a 20, well, you kind of blend them. At least you get something that's a little bit more calibrated.
That's helpful. I was curious exactly how they came about. Does State Street consider those R-factor scores to be accurate and reliable measures of a company's compliance with ESG goals?
We believe they're as good as you can get in terms of at least having the transparency of what the material issues are that are relevant for a particular company, and what the company's self-reported data is related to that particular item. And then we use them as really a basis for engagement. So, for example, we came out publicly to say that the what we call the laggards, which are the lowest, 10% in any particular industry, that we would engage with those companies to understand why it was that their R-factor scores were so poor relative to their industry, and what risks that created and what they were doing about that.
The spreadsheet that State Street provided to this committee showed that on May 22nd, 2020, Exxon had an R-factor score of 65.53, described as an outperformer. Does that sound right?
That's right.
On November 1st, 2020, Exxon had an R-factor score of 66, even better. Is that right?
I don't have that legacy, but I believe you. Yes,
Okay.
sir. That sounds right.
Yet State Street voted against two directors and for those two climate proposals, even though Exxon was outperforming. Is that right?
Well, they were outperforming on the R-factor score, but as I think we discussed earlier in the testimony, they were not outperforming as a stock, as a company.
Do you know whether Exxon's R-factor went up or down the year after you voted against the board and voted for those resolutions?
I don't know the answer to that. We could easily get you that information. They've been fairly stable in having good R-factor scores, in part because there are a lot of things that they're doing right, and that they're disclosing that enables them to get captured by those R-factor scores.
Well, if it's helpful to you, on June 1st, 22, Exxon had an R-factor score of 63. It went down 3 points.
Okay.
Do you plan to vote against those Exxon directors you put on now that they've caused the R-factor score to go down?
No, and again, 63 is still a very credible R-factor score relative to the broad industry, so that would still put them in a good place relative to the industry. They would not be a laggard, for example.
Do you like the trend, 66 to 63?
Again, this is part of the problem with some of these scores, is that they can be over long times, the trend is useful to look at. Over short terms, you can get anomalies, and it could be something like data reporting. The data's a little bit stale, things of that nature. So we're looking for, relative to the peer group, are they an outlier? And then over time, are they relatively stable or trending? And that 63, 66, it would be a rounding error, quite honestly, in this context.
Thank you. I have one more set of votes to ask you about, then we're going to move back to BlackRock. Senator Birdwell, Senator Hall, any other questions for? Hold on 1 second. I'll come back to you. Any other questions for State Street as we wrap this up? Please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, it's been a very long day, and we have to get back to Dallas. Weather is inclement. It's very difficult to get flights out, and we wanted to be here all day. And I was wondering if we might be able to wrap up relatively soon, or perhaps take some of the questions in writing afterwards, so we could get answers. We've been here since 8 this morning. We had 30 minutes for a lunch break. We want to be very respectful. It's 8 hours, and I was just wondering if it might be possible to wrap up so we could get to the airport before we return our rental car, before the flights leave.
I have one more section to visit with Ms. Heidelbat, then some more questions for BlackRock. Then I'm done after that. So do what you need to do. But that's our plan. So I'm almost done.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Hall, Senator Birdwell, anything at this point? I want to ask you about another Chevron vote, 2022. You've probably seen this one. Well, and by the way, you're extremely knowledgeable of these matters, and thank you for your candor and working through these things with us. We appreciate that. Vote in 2022 for Chevron, there was a proposal for a racial equity audit. Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
And Chevron voluntarily said, we'll do an audit of our workforce diversity, but that's not what this was about. This was about greenhouse gas emissions and the disparate impact of greenhouse gas emissions on people of color. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
Some said it was not racial at all. It was really an environmental question couched as a racial one. Chevron's board and the proponents said that the statement cites unsubstantiated, inaccurate allegations and statistics, pardon me, and Chevron opposed that proposal. They said the studies or claim statistics showing there was an outsized effect on people of color was not based on good science. But State Street voted for that proposal. Is that right?
It is, yes.
Did State Street confirm it was in the shareholders' interest to vote for a proposal that the company's management criticized as unsubstantiated and inaccurate?
And again, in this particular case, we thought that it was appropriate for them to conduct that audit, and so we voted in favor of them conducting that audit, respecting that they had a different view. Yes, sir.
What analysis did State Street undertake to see if it was in the financial interest of the shareholders to do the audit?
So in that particular case, we were, again, looking at trends around some of their peers that were doing that kind of work and the expectation that investors would grow to expect that as a matter of course. So it was not a formal financial analysis in that regard.
Are racial equity audits always good for companies, good for shareholders, financial interest?
This is a tricky one. I mean, we certainly believe in combating racial inequities. We've been on record and have taken our own actions in that regard. We do think that it's in the interest of all people to know that they've got kind of a level playing field, and we have advocated on behalf of certain initiatives that support companies, looking at what their practices are in this regard.
You remember in 2021 when shareholders proposed a racial equity audit of State Street Corporation, your parent company. Do you remember that?
I do.
The claim basis for this audit, I'm just going to quote, was that currently State Street's board has no black directors. None of the company's executive leaders are black. In 2017, State Street paid $5 million in back pay to settle Department of Labor charges based on a pay equity analysis that the company paid top female and black workers less than top male and white workers. Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
Were those statistics unsubstantiated and accurate when the proposal was made?
So no comment on that. But if I maybe just a minute. Yeah, we can't comment on the settlement, but can I make a comment about that experience underscores our view that these are important things for management to consider? Okay, so I can't talk about the settlement under the agreement that we reached with the Department of Labor. But what I would say is that that's an example of why we think it is important that companies understand their risks in this regard and conduct these kinds of practices through our own experience there.
And as I understand from documents we've seen, your team was responsible for responding to that proposal through, there was a letter April 22nd of 2021, signed by Ben Colton and Rob Walker. Now, I'm not talking about settlement. I'm just talking about correspondence initially.
Yes.
Okay. And those men report to you, as I understand.
They do. Rob Walker is no longer with the firm, but Ben Colton is the head of our asset stewardship group. Yes, sir.
And State Street Corporation's board recommended that its shareholders vote against the racial equity audit of State Street, didn't they? I didn't say so. I want to know your vote on the audit.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is a matter that's currently under. Got some. I can't comment on that particular issue right now. So
I'm not asking about a settlement with the Department of Labor.
I understand.
I'm asking about the board's vote on whether to conduct a racial equity audit.
So the board did vote against that. That is correct.
Board voted against
sir.
that. Okay, so we voted for the racial equity audit of Chevron, but against the racial equity audit of State Street.
again, it's two different bodies. Like just to confirm, our asset stewardship team did not vote for or against the State Street audit, correct? Yeah, it's a bit of apples and oranges. Is our stewardship team, our stewardship team doesn't vote on matters related to State Street, our parent, because of conflict of interest issues. But you're right to point out that the board of State Street voted against doing that audit. That is correct.
Senators, any other questions from Ms. Hine with State Street? Thank you very much. A few more questions for you. Now, I want to be clear, and I'll talk to you and your lawyer. Though we did subpoena you to be here, no one is being compelled to be here. No one's going to arrest you if you try to leave. Are you okay with talking about some of the votes that BlackRock has taken? Similar questions to what we just had, and that's all I've got.
Sir, I'm happy to answer your questions. I'm just mindful. I'm also just flagging, so just to put it out there that I'm flagging, but I'm here to answer your questions, sir.
Thank you. Would it be fair to say that BlackRock uses its voting power to promote the objectives of the Paris Agreement? In particular, we mean transition to net zero by 2050, just as a practice, as an overarching practice.
No, sir. We use the votes that our clients have entrusted us with as a fiduciary to drive long-term performance.
Now, one or two more things on Climate Action 100 net zero asset managers. According to BlackRock's words, BlackRock joined the organizations because it, quote, believes, BlackRock, quote, believes that the transition to a net zero world is the shared responsibility of every citizen, corporation, and government. Is that a statement that BlackRock still believes?
I'm not sure where you read that from, sir. I have seen that statement, but I don't remember the context around it.
We spoke a lot about the plant here. I want to ask some broad questions about the industry to make sure we haven't missed anything. Does BlackRock invest in utility companies involved in coal, oil, and gas production projects? I think we know the answer, but y'all do invest in those, don't you?
Sir, we're one of the largest investors in the energy sector globally, approximately $280 billion, and a third of that is right here in Texas.
Does BlackRock engage or otherwise encourage these utility companies to phase out coal and gas projects?
Mr. Chairman, we look for disclosures to understand the material risks these companies are facing as increasingly the regulatory, global regulatory initiatives are moving towards net zero. So we are looking for how they're addressing material risks to their businesses, regulatory risks, so that we can deliver performance for our clients, which is our goal as a fiduciary.
Climate Action 100 on its website again. It's net zero company benchmark prerogatives. They're very clear, very stated, very set out. I want to make sure I'm clear. Are you pledging that BlackRock has not pledged to follow the Climate Action 100's net zero company benchmark prerogatives?
Mr. Chairman, I would point you to the letter that we signed when we joined Climate Action 100. It's dated January 6, 2020, and it articulates very clearly to Climate Action 100, and it's on our website, that we are bound as a fiduciary by certain regulations. We are bound by our clients' mandates, and we participate in these conversations, but we are driven by these regulations and mandates that we are bound to as a fiduciary.
So then you can certify to the committee today on behalf of BlackRock that BlackRock will not support Climate Action 100's net zero company benchmark prerogatives.
Sir, we are independent. We look independently as a fiduciary in how to drive long-term performance. We look to understand these risks to the particular businesses on a case-by-case basis because they're different businesses, different sectors. But we're independent. How we do our investments, how we do our voting is done independently.
So then it sounds like BlackRock will not support Climate Action 100's net zero company benchmark prerogatives.
So we believe in that the transition to a low-carbon economy is beneficial for clients' portfolios. We believe in that. We believe there are material risks, climate risks to certain sectors. We believe in that. We look to companies to explain to us how they are managing these risks so we can deliver to our clients. Mr. Chairman, if I may, and I'm listening to all of you today, I really hear your frustration with some of the language and how it can be interpreted, and voting and all that. I just would have you keep in mind a few things as we go through this. Number one, our true performance on behalf of our clients here in Texas. Number two, voting choice. A lot of the questions you're having about voting and how we voted, how we did not vote, our guidelines that we appreciate. We have guidelines that we vote in a particular way. We're very transparent. A lot of institutional investors are not required to be as transparent as asset managers are. By law, we have a huge amount of transparency required, and we actually go even beyond that, which is why you're able to see our voting records. But we appreciate people have different views, and the answer here is voting choice. The answer is more asset owners being able to take back their vote and vote in accordance with, how they want to vote these assets. That is an answer that I think can answer and address a lot of the concerns that you all have.
Has anyone in your company recommended, suggested, encouraged the company to take a public position on a policy adopted in a state? A letter on elections policy, a letter on abortion. Has BlackRock taken the action along those lines with any of the companies that it engages with?
I am not aware of that, Mr. Chairman.
Let me put that in terms of a request to you and to your attorneys. Will you get that to us in writing? We want to know if anyone in your company has recommended, suggested, encouraged, because, and y'all are articulate. We thank you for being here, and the English language is beautiful. It's so beautiful and so nuanced, sometimes we can lose meaning. So we want to be very clear. Whether we call it engagement or encouragement or managing down, we want to know if BlackRock, anyone at BlackRock, is recommended, suggested, encouraged a company to take a public position on a policy adopted in a state. Elections policy, abortion policy, issues of the day, which some companies that happen to show up in a lot of your documents have been taking positions on recently. Unusual for companies to do that. We want to know about that. Will you get that to us in writing?
We are happy to take that back, Mr. Chairman.
Will you take it back, and then will you bring us the answer?
We'll do our best, absolutely.
Well, I'm not asking if you know the answer today, but I'm asking if you'll get me the answer.
Yeah, I think the reason is we will talk to the senior executives in the company and to get you the answer. We can't cover every single individual. We're like a 19,000 member firm, but we will talk to our senior executives and get back to you.
Do you need the request in writing?
Nope.
Very good. We have the identical question for State Street. Has anyone in your company recommended, suggested, encouraged a company to take a position on a policy adopted in a state? Elections policy, abortion policy, any of those issues. I guess they might come under the S of ESG, could come in all kinds of places, but we want to know if anyone at State Street is calling it engagement, calling it whatever you call it, has anyone at State Street recommended, suggested, encouraged a company to take a public position on a policy adopted in a state, be it elections, abortion, any of those matters?
Okay. We'll take that away and come back. Yeah, and my counsel asked if you could please send that specific request in writing. We just want to make sure we understand exactly what you're asking for.
Do we need that to put Do we need that in the form of a,
it-
do we need that in the form of a subpoena, or is a,
No,
is a
no,
formal
no.
request sufficient?
Just a formal written request, just so we can make sure we answer the full contours.
Just like we've been
Yeah.
responding to requests for information previously.
Well, this
We're
is the first.
happy to do it. We're just trying to understand exactly what the contours
Okay.
are, that's
Well-
all.
Well, up until that one, unless I misunderstood, when I've offered to put them in writing, you've said no. Do we need this one in writing? Forgive me if I misremembered that.
Up until now, we were able to understand exactly what the request was, and we said, we'll get it to you. This one, I would like to have in writing. It's a little bit more amorphous to me.
Okay,
Just want to make sure we understand it, sir, that's all.
very good.
We're not trying to be in any way not provide the information. Happy to answer it. I would say we are on record, there were 3 proposals put forward during the proxy season related to reproductive rights, and we voted against all 3 of those because we felt that they were overly prescriptive and that we do believe that companies need to manage these issues on their own behalf.
Senator Hall, anything else for our witnesses from BlackRock and State Street? Anything from you, Senator Hall? Very good. Thank you for being here, for working with us. We'll continue to work with you and your lawyers to get answers to these questions.
Yes, sir.
Glad you came to Marshall. We'll see you next time. Merry
Thank you.
Christmas.
Appreciate the engagement, really do. Thank you.
We'll now
Thank you
open
very much.
public testimony. A lot of our bosses, folks we work for here, our constituents want to participate. And so, well, again, if anybody wants to testify publicly, you can. We ask that you fill out a witness affirmation card. It's just outside that door to my right, to your left, unless you've turned around to leave. Council, see you later.